All right, good evening and welcome to the May 21st, 2019 City Council regular meeting. I'm Mayor Debbie Bertlin. Will the city clerk please call the roll?
Good evening, Mayor. Mayor Debbie Bertlin.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Salim Neese.
Here.
Councilmember Lisa Anderall. Councilmember Bruce Bassett.
Here.
Councilmember Wendy Weicker. Here. Councilmember David Wiesentiner. Here. And Councilmember Benson Wong.
Here.
Great, so our first item of business is to approve the agenda. May I have a motion to approve as presented?
Second.
First and second, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes and the agenda is approved. The City Council will now recess into executive session to discuss pending or potential litigation with legal counsel pursuant to RCW 4230-1101I for approximately 30 minutes. The council is not expected to take final action after this executive session.
C-section babies are always better. Because they're just not squished.
All right, everyone, great. Our executive session adjourned at 7 o'clock. So welcome, everyone. We're continuing our May 21st regular meeting. We're now moving on to special business this evening, and that's Agenda Bill 5561. And it is a proclamation for National Safe Boating and Paddling Week. For this, I welcome our commander, Dave Jokinen, to come down.
Good evening, Council, Mayor. It's nice to see you guys again. I'm Dave Jokinen, your Police Operations Commander, and I'm here with Brian Noel, our Marine Patrol Sergeant, Greg Levinson, our Marine Patrol Officer. And we're here to talk today about National Safe Boating Week. It's observed to bring attention to important life safety tips for recreational boaters so that they can have a safer, more fun experience out on the water throughout the year. And also here with us are some of our partners, the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Accepting the proclamation today from the mayor is Mercer Island resident Carter Harrington. I'll introduce Carter Harrington. Carter has been a Mercer Island resident and member of the Mercer Island Beach Club for 28 years. Carter began boating on his family sailboat when he was 10 years old. And after many adventures, he and his brother became seasoned sailors. One time sailing a 14-foot sailfish 26 miles to Catalina Island. After college, Carter became a Navy pilot and spent 5 years flying from aircraft carriers in the Pacific, which is a very modest description of the selfless service he provided to our nation during the Vietnam War. His introduction to the Pacific Northwest came via a flight into Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. The scenery had a big impact on him as he later decided to make this area his home. After his Navy career, Carter was a commercial pilot spanning 40 years for the Flying Tigers and then FedEx, finally retiring in 2011. He now spends most of his time volunteering on various projects and specifically with the Mercer Island Beach Club. For the last 10 years, he has filled the role of harbor master at the Beach Club with a focus on boater education and water safety, with a special emphasis on water safety for children. Carter and the Mercer Island Beach Club team up with the Mercer Island Marine Patrol every year in hosting a water safety presentation at the beginning of the boating season to emphasize the need to practice good seamanship and how to be safe around water. Carter, would you come on down for me, please? Carter, thank you very much to service to our nation.
Thank you.
And the service to the community.
It's a pleasure,
You've
yeah.
done for all these years.
Enjoy it.
Now the mayor will read the
yeah.
proclamation to you.
Well, you have a couple minutes while I read the proclamation to figure out what you're going to say. Okay. So whereas on average 700 people die per year in boating and paddle sports related accidents in the U.S., with the vast majority of those accidents caused by human error and poor judgment and not by the boat, equipment, or environmental factors. And whereas a significant number of boaters and paddlers who lose their lives by drowning each year would be alive today had they worn their life jackets. And whereas the city of Mercer Island is completely surrounded by Lake Washington, and whereas many of Mercer Island's residents of all ages engage in recreational boating and paddling sports, and whereas the mission of the Mercer Island Beach Club and the Mercer Island Marine Patrol is to promote and improve recreational boating and paddle sport safety by teaching boating safety courses, emphasizing water safety, and conducting vessel safety checks. Now, therefore, I, Mayor Debbie Bertland, do hereby proclaim May 25 through 30, 2019 as Safe Boating and Paddling Week, and encourage all of Mercer Island's residents to dedicate themselves to learning about and practicing safe boating and paddle sports, including wearing life jackets. So welcome, and thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't have a speech. I'm breathless. What he said was enough, really. And I want to thank everybody here because it's a pleasure to be here and do what I do. And it's just a lot of fun. So, and it is all about the families. And my family who moved from Kansas to California, like the officer said, we did everything wrong on that boat. My brother and I and my dad, we did everything wrong, but we didn't sink the boat. That's the only thing we didn't do. So we made all the mistakes, and then that's what I'm trying to correct for the next few years here on Mercer Island. All right, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Pictures?
Yeah, we need a picture.
I can do that, yeah.
Here, guys. No, we need a picture. Yeah. Coast Guard Ox, you guys want to come on up?
Right here.
Oh, yeah, please, let's have our Coast Guard sergeants, please. Come on up.
Oh, you want us over here? Here or here?
Let me do this. All right, there we go.
Push and hold.
Not that-
Right.
Thank you very much.
Super. So now we're going to hope for some great weather this weekend to get our safe boating week off on good, mostly good footing, but good practices. Next up on our agenda, we actually have the city manager's report, and for that we welcome City Manager Julie Underwood.
Good evening, Council. My report's pretty short this week. Thank you. You're clicking for me. Thank you. I just want to say a huge thanks to Neighbors in Motion for hosting booths at Northwood, Island Park, and West Mercer Elementary Schools. They shared information about safe bicycling, encouraging helmet use, and handing out copies of the city's new bike map. So thanks, NIMS, for public education of our youth. Also, in observance of Memorial Day, city facilities will be closed, thank you, on Monday, May 27th. This includes the community center. There are no programs or rentals offered on that day. National Trails Day and letterboxing is on Saturday, June 1st, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. at Pioneer Park. Meet in the northwest quadrant along 68th across from Starbucks. Pick up your clue books at the Community Center, Luther Burbank offices, and the South End Starbucks. And of course, if you can't make it on June 1, letterboxes will stay up through October 31st. We also have a restoration event on Saturday, June 1st, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at Clark Beach in Luther Burbank. Visit mercergov.org to learn more about that event. And excited to see another season of the Mercer Island Farmers Market is returning on June 2nd. It's their 11th season, and the market runs through October 29th. It's at the usual spot on the northwest corner of Mercer Dell Park. So visit mifarmersmarket.org for the full schedule, as well as vendors and performance information. And then I just wanted to say, I just introduced the community to B.O. Park. He is our assistant city attorney, but he will actually be serving as the interim city attorney. So please join me and welcome him in that new role. So, thanks.
Thank you. Julie, one of the questions I've received regarding the farmers market is, will the parking still be in the same place? Will it be at farmers, or are people more in the hunt and search for parking place mode?
Thank you for that. And many residents probably have noted the bollards that have gone up at the former farmers insurance, and unfortunately it is not available. So it's my understanding folks will want to look for Orange Street parking or any public parking nearby. So it's unfortunate, but at this point, Farmers Market hasn't identified any other locations.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, so next item on the agenda is appearances, and this is the opportunity for anyone to speak to the City Council on any item. When it is your turn to address the council, please be sure to speak audibly into the podium microphone. State your name for the record, and please limit your comments to 3 minutes. The expanded rules are on the back door. So with that, asking the city clerk if we have anyone signed up.
We do, Mayor. We have Pashmi Vaini, Deborah Alderman, Josh Nope, Ryan Thomas.
Great, so please come on down. And Deb, when you're ready, we can start the clock. Welcome.
Hi, welcome. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Pashmi Vani, address 4207 West Mercer Way. I want to thank the City Council and the Mayor for this opportunity to speak. I'm here to talk about the rooftop deck rail exemption from building height, and not just on behalf of me and my family, but several other families who live on slopey, curvy hillside properties on Mercer Island. Before I start going into, I want to just say I did send an email, so all the details I did lay out on our appeal regarding this issue. But I just want to add and put some more emphasis on some key points today. So I want to start by saying that rooftops have a cultural significance for me and my husband. We come from India. We were born, raised there. But that's not the reason why we put it in our remodel plan. The primary reason for us to put this in the remodel design for our house is because of the safety issue. Our house is on a busy street. It's not safe for our young children to play outside. There's no backyard space either. So this was the most viable option that we decided to consider. The discussion that's ongoing with the City Council on removal of this 3-foot railing has a strong negative impact for any beneficial use of our property, and that's one of the reasons for me standing here today. For reference, I just want to say I'm exactly 5 feet tall. 3 feet tall is to my mid-forearm, which is barely visible. If we design an open railing, it's pretty much a line in the sky. We're we're not making this design to cause any hindrance to any neighbors or, cause any obstruction on our property or to our neighbors' properties. So just want to emphasize that. I also want to say that because the house is on a steep slope, the perception of the height of the property is about 22 feet tall with the railing. So from the street, it really appears to be a smaller house than a regular, house. And it's on a ravine, so there's no neighbor on the backyard either that will be obstructed because of this, structure that we've put in our design. I felt like, and I did put this in the email, that this issue that's under discussion strongly puts a penalty on our structure, but I feel like in future, any house on a slope, if they want to consider some viable property use space on their property, it'll impact their decision too. Before I end, I want to say that we've lived here 4 years. We love this community. We know that the city is a safe haven for our children. It's a growing, diverse community of people. We really love it here. And this decision will impact us from, unfortunately, moving out and finding another property off the island. So just a sincere appeal as a voter, as a taxpayer, as a, fond member of this community. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next. Welcome.
Hello, my name's Josh Knopp. I, 485-9 68th Avenue Southeast, Mercer Island. I'm here for the shoreline master plan. We're concerned with trying to upgrade our dock, our decking surface, and we're questioning, seeing if we will look into the part of it where we have to reduce our first 30 feet of the dock from the current width we have down to a 4-foot wide approach if we're doing more than the 50% of our dock upgrades. We want to go from a solid wood plank to the nice, 40% light grading that's now recommended or required. And with this reduction, losing our property in some ways by reducing that first approach, is just going to cause us to cancel our project. And I know we've had, a couple of years ago, I've been working with a general contractor with properties, and we've been doing the same thing of trying to update and improve our properties with this dock work. And we keep running into the same issue and canceling projects because of this mandate, this ordinance. So if you'd see if we can change that where we, my property owner and others can upgrade their projects willingly by maintaining their own dock size, that'd be great. So that's all I'm after. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council, my name is Ryan Thomas. I'm an attorney at Perkins Coie. I submitted a letter you may have received yesterday on behalf of Citizens for Reasonable Shoreline Policies. It's an association of island residents, businesses, voters who are interested in item 5 of today's agenda, which is the adoption of the Shoreline Master Program update, similar to what Josh Knott was talking about. So the existing non-conforming dock provision is not currently being changed. I want to make that clear. I saw some correspondence from planning staff about that. There's a clarification that they're making, but that's not really what's at issue here. What is of concern to me and to the association is the current existing non-conforming dock provision. So the way it's currently set up, if a resident were to be updating 50% of the decking or 50% of the structure of a dock, it would require bringing the entire dock into compliance with the code. And so our concern is we think there's a disincentive for voluntary environmental upgrades. So if somebody wanted to replace just the decking with, say it's a wood deck on the dock, and they wanted to upgrade it to the transparent decking, which would be required by code, that would also trigger reducing some of the structure width. So the first 30 feet from the shoreline would then need to be reduced to 4 feet. So all of a sudden you've got somebody who just wants to do a voluntary environmental upgrade of the decking, and now they're required to do some real structural work, which is costly and may require in-water work, and ultimately would require reducing the pier width and the pilings. Now, I know staff has said that is not a requirement of the code, and that's true. It's not an express requirement of the code that the pilings wouldn't need to come together. But the functional outcome is that you would need to reduce the piling width. Otherwise, you've got kind of long stringers going out to pilings, which prevents it from being usable for boats, or there's some safety issues there as well. So we're asking that the city consider this non-conforming dock provision to essentially decouple the decking portion from the structure portion, so that a resident could go replace their decking voluntarily with this transparent grading and not be required to do work on the structure. If they were to do work on the structure at a certain threshold, then that would require them to meet the code required 4-foot width within 30 feet. But currently, we think that it's not reasonable, doesn't make sense to have a decking upgrade trigger this width reduction. In the comment letter, I provided some examples from other jurisdictions and what they're doing. I think if you take a look at those, you'll see that Mercer Islands is a bit more onerous and burdensome on residents than the other jurisdictions. Kirkland, it's decoupled, so deck surface work does not trigger structure work. Same with Bellevue, it's decoupled and has a 75% threshold for when you'd have to actually do work on the structure, compared to Mercer Island's 50%. Medina is very similar. It's decoupled, the decking and the structure is decoupled, and it's a 75% threshold. So I would ask you to take a look at that letter. I do recommend, I have a recommended provision in the letter that would ask that council would take a look at it and consider adopting. And I think that's my time. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Deb, is there any chance to get the yellow light on at 30 seconds? It's going straight from green to red.
Good evening. My name is Callie Rodolfi, and I live at 3432 72nd Avenue Southeast. I want to thank the council for making a greenhouse gas reduction target back 12 years ago in 2007 to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050. And I also appreciate some of the council's participation last week, and along with other citizens, in the countywide climate summit that was held last Saturday. Since 2007, significant efforts have been made by the city to reduce fleet emissions, energy use, move to green power, and to manage waste more sustainably. But there's more that we as an entire community can do to reduce our carbon footprint, and also begin to work on a climate action plan. Island Vision is a 501c3 organization that encourages sustainability on the island. And last year, we contracted with a greenhouse gas consultant to do a technical analysis of the community's carbon footprint community-wide. And we thank the city for sharing the carbon data with us so that we could do this audit and analysis. And I guess the big take home, which will be of no surprise to you, is that vehicle miles traveled, or vehicle emissions, is the majority of our carbon footprint here on the island. Of course, another major source is energy use in buildings. We think it's important to track our carbon emissions and to encourage low carbon transportation options, solar projects, home energy audits, and also to make better use of the Scope 5 tool, which the city has access to. To meet our carbon reduction target, we're going to need a 70% reduction from the 2016 levels by 2050. Our annual emissions, at least in 2016, were 203,000 metric tons of CO2 that year. And the target for 2050 is 42,000. That's where I get the 70%. Over 70% reduction is needed. And realizing that city resources are limited, Island Vision proposes to partner with the city to work on an annual dashboard of carbon, helping the city with compiling data, and also developing some indicators that will meaningfully measure our actions toward a more carbon-free future. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to mention here that I do have a two-pager with the highlights of our evaluation, and also a proposed letter of intent for a partnership that I'll leave with the city. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. Is there anyone else for public appearances? All right, with that, public appearances is...
Mayor, we did
Oh.
have Mr. Owen's son on here.
Do we have anyone else for public? Come on down. Super. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Hi, my name is Owen Sun. Our family property is at 7240 North Mercer Way, and this is my first time appearing before you, so thank you. I'd like to re-echo actually some of the other issues that were brought up today that happen to affect our property. I'm actually planning to build a family home there. It is a waterfront property with a steep slope. So the first issue that we have is we've been planning a rooftop deck, which when we came into the pre-application meeting a few weeks ago, we're surprised to hear that there would be potentially a change to the rules not allowing us to build that rooftop deck. For a couple reasons, we would like to have that deck. The home is far from the road. Actually, it's a 2-parcel lot, so where the house is actually being built is practically not visible from the road. My understanding from hearing from the planners is that the issue with these decks is that they could be bulky, unsightly, etc. Our house is going to be built in a kind of a modern fashion, so with a glass railing, so any rooftop deck would be minimally visible. Also, the way the sun sets on our property, we're sort of, because of the slope, we're facing a northeast direction. The sun sets quite early in the summer, and our design with the rooftop deck was to try to take advantage of the setting sun. During the middle of the day, that'd be kind of the only area really with sunshine, considering also the trees on our property. The other reason is, minimally visible. So yeah, regarding the rooftop deck, I'd like to request that you guys either reconsider your vote for that, or maybe consider exceptions to certain types of properties, whether they have slopes, whether these houses are clearly visible from public roads, or perhaps allowing exceptions with respect to materials used, if they're glass, and also potentially setbacks from the roof, if those could make it more possible to do these rooftop decks. Last remaining seconds, we also have an issue with our dock on the water. It was built in the 50s, I believe, so it's been sitting there for a long time. It's not in great condition, but we would like to bring it up to speed. And the issues we've been running into are, anytime we try to mitigate or try to update the dock for mitigation factors, we still run into this 4-foot, 30-foot, 4-foot wide issue. So right now, in order for us to abide by that, we're gonna have to be doing a lot more work, which I think actually might cause more issues to what you're trying to mitigate to begin with. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Is there anyone else for public appearances? Okay, seeing none, public appearances is now closed. The next item of business on our agenda is the consent calendar. The consent calendar contains payables, payroll, minutes from April 30th, 2019 special meeting, and May 7th, 2019 regular meeting. We also have AB 5568, the Planning Commission's recommendation for code cleanup amendments, the second reading and adoption. Is there a motion to approve the consent calendar as presented?
Actually,
I'd like to pull 5568, if I could.
second.
Is that yours as well? Okay, so pulling 5568. With that as amended, is there a motion, yes, is there a motion to approve the consent calendar for payables, payroll, and minutes of April 30 and May 7?
So moved. Second.
First and second, any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, passes. That then means that the first item of regular business this evening will be AB 5568, the Planning Commission's recommendation for code cleanup amendments. Bruce, I think you pulled?
Right. So you'll recall, council members, at the last meeting that I was in favor of a limited form of rooftop deck permission. And that ultimately I was not successful in that suggestion to council. In the time since that meeting, I have had a chance to talk to a couple of folks about it, and what I hadn't appreciated, and I think maybe others hadn't fully appreciated either, was the situation in which this becomes particularly valuable to the homeowner is the situation where they have a steep sloped property and their opportunity to have outdoor living space is quite limited in the first place. This is something I hadn't really appreciated, as I was suggesting that it might not be an unreasonable thing to allow. But having now heard a couple of instances of that here and a couple of instances of that concern elsewhere, I thought I'd at least take the pulse of the council and see if that further information generated different thinking amongst other council members. And if it doesn't, it doesn't, but I remain supportive of allowing it as long as it, in contradiction to what was said here, I support the idea that it's a railing that is not going to be occluding light. Therefore, it needs to be not a glass railing, but a wire railing of some kind that has minimal blocking of light, and therefore has not the appearance of being a solid wall. But I put that out there. I do not have language to offer here tonight, so I'm looking only for whether there's an appetite for it, and if there were, I would suggest that then we would ask staff to actually develop some language for us, and if there's not, so be it.
Great, Wendy.
So I'm going to echo and support Bruce in that recommendation. I hadn't really been thinking enough about the visibility and the special circumstances where the rooftop railings might be really critical for families looking for outdoor space. I too talked to a bunch of other people in the last couple of weeks to learn more about this issue, and I know we had talked about it only affecting 5 or 6 permits that had come through in the previous year. And it sounds like the 5 or 6 times that comes through, it's in these extenuating circumstances where they just don't have any other outdoor space. So I would be in favor of figuring out the language to provide some exceptions to support lots that have the possibility of rooftop decks where there aren't any others and where neighbors won't be impacted and the views aren't going to be obstructed. So whatever that language looks like, I'd turn to Evan to help us figure that out, because I'd like to make sure those families that have very limited opportunities for outdoor space can get it.
Great, so I see Benson and then Lisa.
I just want to make sure I understand what, I don't think rooftop decks were necessarily prohibited. I thought the issue that we were struggling with last meeting was the railings and the height of the railings in excess of the 30-foot maximum height. So I want to make it clear, if I'm wrong, correct me, but I don't think there's any prohibition about rooftop decks. It's simply a matter of the height of the railings.
And
Mayor.
Steve, I would just, can I comment? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to clarify what your concerns or your opportunity is.
So we're talking about critical area ordinances later too, and my understanding is steep slopes and lots with issues, the building footprint is often smaller. So the 30 feet is where the home height limit is, and this decking possibility is a little bit higher in some situations, but sometimes the only space you have to be outside.
Welcome, Evan.
Pardon me, Mayor, Council, I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize. I'm, of course, Evan Maxim, your Community Development and Planning Director. So just to echo Councilmember Wong's comment, this isn't a prohibition on rooftop decks. This would be a limit on the railing associated with the rooftop deck exceeding the 30-foot height limit. Certainly, staff can craft language along the lines of what I've heard a few council members describe. I'll repeat it back to you if that's the consensus of the council tonight.
Lisa?
Thanks, Evan. I have a question for you. What would be the current code requirement for the height of a railing on a rooftop deck, regardless of how tall the building is?
So currently, the section of code that we're discussing describes things that are allowed above the 30-foot height limit.
Right, but I mean, let's say you have a 20-foot house and it's got a rooftop deck. Our code has something in it that says how tall that railing has to be, right?
Typically, your minimum railing height is 3 feet or 3.5 feet.
Okay, so 36 or 42 inches?
Yeah.
Okay. And this prohibition here would only touch homes that have already maxed out at 30 feet.
Yes. Or, well, pardon me, Councilmember, just to be precise, a home that was, say, 29 feet tall would not be able to have a railing 36 inches.
And, I mean, what is the, not to get too far in the weeds, but what's the difference between when a 36-inch railing is required and when a 42-inch railing is required?
I don't know that I can actually answer that off the cuff. I apologize.
Because I thought it was all 42 inches, but,
And I'm going off memory, Councilmember, so I'm perhaps mistaken.
yeah, sorry, I didn't know this was going to come up as an issue today, or I would have given you time to research that question, but.
Of course.
Any other council members? Celine?
Maybe you can just remind the council what the scope of the planning commission was doing with the residential design standards, and if this discussion has drifted outside of that scope.
Are you, can you clarify, Councilmember?
Sure,
Neese?
yeah. So my understanding was it was code cleanup. And so now we're debating the merits and the cases in which you may or may not be able to exceed the 30-foot height limit. Maybe if you're on a steep slope, maybe if you have children, maybe if you are going to use a clear railing. To me, it feels beyond the scope of that, something that maybe a larger community conversation might need to happen, as we had all throughout the residential design standards. And what I would hate to do and not have the chance to discuss is, are we short-circuiting the process that we already prescribed upon ourselves by doing this?
So the code cleanup amendments, as we've been referring to them, are typically amendments where we think there's typographical errors in the draft code, or pardon me, in the existing code, or areas where we believe that the current code standard is insufficiently clear for the city staff to administer on behalf of the city council. In the particular example, and I'll direct the council's attention, if I may, to page 4 of Agenda Bill 5568. The section we're discussing is on lines 8 through 15, and it has been amended to reflect the council's direction at your first reading. That section contains both plain text, which is the existing language, and underlined text, which is the added language. The section at the moment under the current code, so I'm paraphrasing a little bit what's on the page, describes a number of things that are allowed to exceed above the 30-foot height limit to a maximum of 5 feet. And it lists there, again paraphrasing, antennas, lighting rods, chimneys, fireplaces, and other similar appurtenances. The term appurtenances is also defined in your code, and I apologize, it's not in your packet. We were not proposing to change it. But it includes a number of things beyond the items listed on page 4 of your packet, which include fences. So the question we were attempting to ask the Planning Commission and now, of course, the City Council is, does that term appurtenances here correctly include railings or not? And that truly was the intent behind the clarification request to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission's recommendation after discussing it in October and December was to say, essentially, yes, railings should be allowed under this exception. And I've understood the City Council, for the reasons articulated previously, to say no, they should not be allowed. What your staff is really seeking here is clarification.
So in other words, we're going from the definition of, I'm going to kill the pronunciation, appurtenances, thank you, appurtenances, and we've leapt into actual code debate and discussion as to whether or not we should allow rooftop decks that go above 30 feet.
And appurtenances, by definition, again, I apologize, it's not in front of you tonight, includes things like hot tubs, swimming pools, fences, garages, things that clearly would not be appropriate on a rooftop, and then things that may be appropriate on a rooftop, and hence the question. So in my mind, Deputy Mayor, this was a clarification request to the Planning Commission originally. It does bleed a little bit into that gray area you might characterize as part of our residential development standards update.
I'm going to actually take a turn at this. And to me, I feel like we have quickly gone from what is a definitional discussion to actually having a clear direction from the Planning Commission, arguably having heard from the public as to whether or not rooftop decks should or should not be a part of the use under certain circumstances, or part of the structure under certain circumstances. So for me, in that context, I am far more comfortable remanding this back to the Planning Commission for discussion, either amongst themselves and or the public, to ensure that we are not going from a definitional discussion to one that is actually going to substantially impact whether it's current and or potential future homeowners, remodels, new construction, whatever it may be. I know I'm probably not prepared to have, well, I'm definitely not prepared to have a detailed discussion tonight, but I would certainly like to see the Planning Commission take it up again. So that's where I would fall. Anyone else on council?
Well,
Lisa?
I think this is kind of a complicated issue because we're not just talking about railing, we're talking about creating an outdoor room on a rooftop that is going to extend, the railing extends 3 feet up, but then we're creating a space where furniture and umbrellas and, you know, other solid objects can be put. And so the requirement to have the railing be transparent is kind of illusory in terms of preserving neighbors' views. And so I don't know that we really have enough information. I'm very sympathetic to the people who spoke here today who said that, you know, our property is off the road and nobody's behind us and we're not going to harm anyone. And I'm sympathetic to their desire to use their property in the way that they want to. And maybe there is a way to create some exceptions that doesn't kind of gut the whole 30-foot building height requirement. But I don't know that that's what's on the agenda in front of us today.
So would you like to remand it back to Planning Commission? What would be your recommendation?
You know, I think that the ordinance that's before us actually does what we asked, which was code cleanup. And then if there was a desire on part of council to ask for a new ordinance or an amendment to an ordinance to be created, to possibly create some ability to ask for an exception or a waiver on a case-by-case basis, I wouldn't be opposed to studying that.
Okay, so in essence, you would like to go ahead and pass it as a definitional matter and then allow Evan during the court, allow Evan, that doesn't sound right. So encourage that whenever we pick up residential code development, to pick this up as an issue, which I think is still another year or two away, given where we landed a few years back. Anybody else on council? Because otherwise I'm going to need a motion on something. I'm seeing Benson and Wendy.
Go ahead, Wendy, if you want.
So, I'm sorry, so what are you asking?
Well, we got
remand
to
it
figure out
back,
what we're going
or-
to do. So the question, I mean, I think we have a couple options. The first one is, we have a motion in front of us. I would suggest that we remand this back to Planning Commission for discussion as intentional in terms of building design within our residential code. And there's probably some other option. We could probably try to figure it out tonight. We could take it up as council without having the input from Planning Commission. But I don't think that we as a council nor staff would be ready to go there.
Okay, so I would be in favor of remanding it back and getting some clarifications around exceptions for properties on steep slopes or with enough space that neighbors wouldn't be impacted with views.
Bruce, do you want to help?
I just wanted to, if I could ask Evan, could you help us understand what it might mean to do that? I mean, I don't know where the will of the council is yet, but just, is it, do we have a planning commission that would have the capacity? Is it possible to keep a pretty narrowly defined question going back to them around the possibility of this with constraints on it? Or is that sort of well outside the scope of things that they could be working on at this point? I'm looking for the feasibility of doing that, I guess.
I think it's certainly feasible, Councilmember, that the timing may be part of that question you're asking, though. The Planning Commission is just starting to transition back to focusing on the comprehensive plan amendments for 2019 and the community facility code amendments. And we do have a list of things to pursue after. We are initiating another round of minor code amendments, which this is clearly not the way I hear the council describing it at the moment. If it's the council direction that you want to prioritize this over those other items, we would certainly bring it to the Planning Commission sooner. If this is something that should be part of the RDS report back, which is scheduled for 2020, we would do it at that time. So I would actually ask the council to give me a little bit of sense of relative priority of this conversation, given some of your other work plan items.
So the other thing I would point out is it seems that we would be leaving several residential projects in limbo during that period of time. I'm looking to, is that correct? So if we,
So the challenge at the moment is administering the code as it stands, which, as it stands, it says other similar appurtenances, which leaves it to your code official, which by happenstance is me, to try and figure out whether railings are allowed or not. So far, my read of the city council is that they are not without further discussion. So that would be likely the way I would administer to your code until we saw an intentional change.
Lisa.
Thank you. Just to maybe shed a little bit of additional light on this from a different perspective, Evan, are you aware of any applications in the last 12 or 24 months for structures with rooftop decks, either as new construction or remodels, that would have fallen into this gray area, and how were those ruled on?
So I'm aware of two, I believe, at the moment. And when I say aware, I should make it clear to the council, I'm not actually reviewing the building permits. I'm consulting with the planning staff that review, one of whom is sitting in the audience and presented to you at the first reading, Andrew Leon. Another project, I believe, is the woman who spoke earlier this evening, and I apologize, I've lost the name in the intervening time. I don't know that we have been entirely consistent around the application of other similar appurtenances, which again is part of the motivation on my part to obtain clarification.
Is an allowed appurtenance the means in which to get to the roof under the new code on a 30-foot tall structure? So if you weren't contemplating adding a rail and you wanted to gain access to your roof and you needed ingress and egress, is that under the code cleanup, and if we were to pass this agenda bill as it stands, allowed?
So when you ask that
Like a hatch door.
like a hatch door or something of that nature, that likely would be something we would treat as a similar appurtenance. A hatch door, in my mind, would be maybe 6 inches above the 30-foot height limit. The difference would be that your rooftop would not be surfaced with a deck and intended for, say, daily use. It
Sure.
would be for maintenance of some sort.
So is it also fair to say that somebody could provision for a future deck and a railing under the current code, that their project wouldn't be stalled out?
If they so chose, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to ask a question. This is always the awkward, oh, there we go. Okay. So let me ask a question. If you were to build a house, and let's say that it is a flat-roofed house, and it's 30 feet tall, and you had a hatch, the ability to get through the house up onto the roof, and you put a table and chairs up there but no railing, is it legal? Because, well, there is one in our neighborhood, but never mind. But I mean, I'm curious, because is this ultimately the way that Essentially what we could be doing is incenting what I would call dangerous behavior.
I don't know if I'm equipped to answer that question, Mayor.
Then don't.
So,
Yeah.
Debbie, I can answer that question because I have that house and we have a hatch in a closet that you drag a ladder up to get up to sweep the roof. It's not safe to be on a 30-foot roof.
Well, no, it's
without
not
the proper
safe.
decking, and it's not going to happen. You can't design a house that way.
It likely would be a safety hazard that we would require correction of.
Okay. Well, council, okay. We're kind of back to where we were. We got to figure our way out of this one. We have a remand to Planning Commission, but I think it would have to be tightly scoped and with a preferential timeline. We can go ahead and work within the motion that we have here, or somebody's got a brilliant third idea. Bruce?
I guess I'll suggest that I would be supportive of the send it back to Planning Commission with a pretty tight mandate to try to create an exceptions may be the wrong word, but an allowance for this, but tightly constrained so that it's not. I'll let the deputy mayor speak for himself. We were speaking offline a moment ago. That it's clear that it's only under certain circumstances that it's permitted, and those are circumstances that make some sense because you're on a steep slope or you have other constraints on the property that make this a somewhat unusual and compelling case for it. That to me would be fine. I appreciate Evan's comment that the Planning Commission has a full workload. I'm not sure how you craft this such that it doesn't become a serious impingement on that, but that's what I would certainly be attempting to direct them to do if I were king for the day.
If you were king for the day, is there somebody else who would agree with the king for the day? Okay, I'm seeing one. All right, so I'm actually going to look to our Assistant City Attorney. Do we need a full motion, or do we just do a thumbs up in terms of testing the waters regarding a remand back to Planning Commission?
Well, you're asked to either approve or deny this agenda bill. You can, at this time, change that and not take a vote on it, and instruct staff to take it out of consideration.
Mayor,
Yes.
may I make a suggestion? Pending the city attorney's agreement, it might make sense to recommend approval of the ordinance as contained in your agenda bill, with the exception of this particular amendment, and then separately remand the amendment. And I say that only because there are other clarifications that I think are of value in the ordinance itself.
I think that's good advice. All right, does anybody want to make a motion accordingly? Bruce?
Try. I would move to adopt ordinance number 19C-04, amending Title 19 MICC to clarify development standards and rename the Development Services Group to the Community Planning and Development Department, and further to direct the staff to revisit the question of rooftop decking with the City Planning Commission.
First and second, any conversation?
And if I could, I do want to speak to, what I'm suggesting is that, not that we change E, building height, just leave it as is for right now, because it's, you might as well get the solar panel part of it done. Rather than leave that out, and then just let them go and address this question.
So
of
with the
rooftop decks.
exception, so to pass it as proposed with the exception.
It's not
There's
even
no
an
exception. There's no exception.
I'm just
So-
asking that staff go ahead and take a look at this question of the rooftop decks as a separate piece.
So keeping what would be E3B in,
And then directing staff to come
I don't
back.
see any 3B in my version.
it would be page 8,
I see.
line 14.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Rooftop railings may not extend above the maximum allowed height for the
You know,
main structure.
Okay, my apologies. I was not reading B. And, yeah, so that, okay. I'd like to withdraw the motion. I'm sorry.
Wendy, you gonna withdraw your second? I think we're
Turn
gonna.
my microphone on. I would move that the council pass the amendments to the ordinance as shown and direct the planning commission to bring a recommendation as to whether exceptions to E3B are appropriate and what the process should be to follow, to pursue such exceptions.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, first and second. Lisa, do you want to speak to it?
I thought
Or
I
you
just
think-
did.
Well, I was gonna say, you can also say what you've, you know,
No, I mean,
sufficient.
I think, I have kind of strong opinions about things, but I'm also open, and I was very much against the rooftop deck railing when we talked about it the last time, and I think most council were, but I like to think that I'm open to, considering specific facts and circumstances. I don't think that every rooftop deck at a 30-foot home is gonna be appropriate for every rooftop on a 30-foot home is going to be appropriate to have a deck or railing, but there are certain circumstances, some of which were described here today, that tend to, be persuasive without deciding. So I think that we should look at it in more detail with an open mind.
Okay, so the way I understand the motion to currently be directing us is we accept the amendments, the code cleanup in its entirety, and then that would, in essence, continue to keep the rooftop railings out until the planning commission has the opportunity to take a look at it and go through whatever processes, are appropriate. So that is what I understand that the current motion, how it would read. Evan?
Mayor, may I ask a quick clarification? If you could, at some point as a council, provide direction as to priority in bringing this back to planning commission and back to council 2019, 2020, something of that nature would be useful.
Okay. So what I'm hearing then, the two options, the current one is that essentially we approve as is, which would eliminate the option for the rooftop railing today. At the same time, it would remand it back to Planning Commission for further conversation. We'd have to figure out with what parameters and what timeline. The other option, where I had understood, I think Councilmember Bassett was going, was to approve the code cleanup without including excluding the commentary on the railing and remand it back to the Planning Commission, which would then leave it up to our planning director to interpret the code in the interim. Let's see. So I'm also understanding that we have the chair of the Planning Commission here. Commissioner Hubble, would you like to come on up? And you're waving, so I'm assuming you're ready to speak.
Sorry, I just wanted to...
Would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Daniel Hubble. I'm the chair of the Planning Commission. I think 2 points that when we've discussed this in the past, if we think about the building heights, the intent of building height was to appease mass and scale of a building. And the original intent of rooftop decks having a permeation of what, 80%, I believe, is the percentage, was the idea that we have a number of structures that are allowed above the 30-foot height limit, and we know that they are unobtrusive from a bulk and scale perspective. So height is sort of there to say, hey, we want bulk and scale of a building to have this thing. And if you have a rail, you have a number of things that are allowed on a roof. I think Evan has described those earlier. We've talked about furniture and hot tubs and all those sorts of things. And so a rail that has a permeability doesn't impact the bulk and scale of the building from the street view. And so all I would say is that in the previous review from the Planning Commission, our perspective based on the definition that was provided is that it was assumed that if you allow all of these other things on a rooftop above 30 feet, that of course you would need the safety required to accommodate those things, and they should be at a visual permeability that does not impede the bulk and scale of a building, which is what the building height is intended to, to enforce, right? So From our perspective, the direction of allowing railings is there as a life safety measure to accommodate the things that are allowed as appurtenances. And certainly you can talk about the appropriate where those things should be as far as where they're allowed within the adjacency of the edge of the building or not. But from our perspective, we've reviewed this. If you remand it back to us, we'd be glad to talk about this more. But I know that we've talked about this at some length. And from our perspective, it's a life safety issue to allow for the things that were already allowed in the definition that I believe Evan has described earlier.
Okay, I know Bruce, and then Lisa.
I was going to ask, but actually your last couple sentences sort of answered before I asked. But so if I were to more bluntly say what you've said, I think you've said the Planning Commission has already considered this. Go, council, figure out what you want to do. We'll talk more about it if you want, but we've already reached a consensus on this. So what I'm hearing is it really is more in the council's court at this point than back to the Planning Commission's court.
I think the clarification is that we have not had this as an item, a specific conversation within the Planning Commission, but certainly within the definition of what we have allowed based on what we presented to you in the past. It was certainly something that has been tacitly approved, right? Like it's something that should be there. By approving the other things that we've brought forward to you and have been approved, tacitly you should approve the safety requirements that are accordance with those things.
Okay, we have Lisa, then Salim, then Benson.
Okay. Well, Daniel, thanks for being here to present. And I think nobody opposes the safety requirements. It's just a question of whether you extend into, above the 30-foot line. And I think that my question from council would be, if we asked you, if council said we don't think it's appropriate to put a living room on a 30-foot roof, except in kind of extraordinary circumstances, can the Planning Commission craft a recommendation as to what sort of criteria should be considered in terms of whether to grant an exception or a waiver?
We'd certainly be happy to look at any of those things that you want to send back to us. I think the original recommendation that has come forward that's been approved around what appurtenances are allowed is based on, particularly given the topography of Mercer Island, an ideal of how do we allow people to preserve the property around their building, especially in geologic hazardous areas and sensitive areas related to geology and topography. Let's make use of the structure itself rather than, building more on a steep slope, for example, on East Mercer Way. So we'd be happy to look at it more if that's the way the council chooses. I do believe that the recommendation as it came forward in allowing these features is congruent with the definitions that have been previously approved related to appurtenances. But again, if the council's desire is for us to look at that more, we'd be happy to do it.
Okay, we have Salim, then Benson, then Bruce.
So the issue that I have, Commissioner, is that the context that I would like the issue looked at is within the incentives of a 30-foot tall flat-roofed house versus a gabled sloped roof, hip-roofed house. And if we provide an incentive for one house to max out the building height, which was relative to the massing, and then go stick a living room on top of it, we are providing an incentive that will get us less of something else. So the context is within that larger framework, which we all kind of grappled with through the RDS process of how do you strike a balance within the community of types of massing that is allowed and that you will get. And we wanted to have, a couple years of new RDS to see what would the code yield. And if we had this kind of short circuit point 1 year in, this is this is not that far in, start to give an incentive to a flat roof 30-foot house to have a rooftop deck, I think it's conceivable we'll get more of that, not less of that, but we'll certainly not be on equal footing. I will say that in the code cleanup, we looked at first floor patios and second floor decks. And we made the determination, based on your recommendation, that a first floor patio is lot coverage, it's hardscape, but when it's elevated in the air, it's GFA. So we are saying that things in the air mean something different than things on the ground. And now that we're combining those two, right? Something that's on the ground, something that's protruding in the air, and putting it on the roof, we're kind of yielding this decision based on appurtenances and definitions of smokestacks and ingress, egress to a roof to sweep it or blow it and calling it life safety. I think it has to happen within the context of a discussion of, will we provide an incentive that will put out of balance what we did with RDS? And I would personally say this should be within the context of the RDS discussion when it is regularly scheduled to come back to the Planning Commission, which was, I think, 2020. So that's my view. I think we should pass this as it stands, not go monkey with it. If people want to provision for it and then provision later because RDS standards changed, that would be their call. But I wouldn't want to short circuit at this point.
Okay, we have Benson, Bruce, then Wendy.
Well, as I recall, that the motion is to approve the ordinance as presented, but with further direction to the Planning Commission to look at possible variances or exceptions to how to proceed, but not necessarily to approve those. So I'm inclined to remand it. I mean, just listening to the discussion, obviously anybody can come up with a different scenario, and obviously the homeowners that were here had a passion plea, but we can come up with different scenarios where you're concerned about people taking advantage of it or what have you. So to me, it's difficult to come up with a hard, fast rule, but obviously this is a start setting the baseline, but also giving direction to the Planning Commission. And I think, frankly, I think it's something that, since the Planning Commission has already looked at this, I think maybe we should give them a direction in terms of 2019, if they can put it onto their work plan. One thing I did not hear in our earlier discussion that the commissioner brought up was the whole, obviously you guys talked about it in terms of safety issues, and that discussion, that perspective was not discussed when this thing came to us the first time. I'd like to get a little bit a better idea of what the Planning Commission was thinking in total on this issue. So that's another reason for remanding it. I think there are so many different variations that are possible, but I hear the Deputy Mayor's point, and so I'm certainly in favor of passing the ordinance as is, but giving further direction to the Planning Commission.
Okay, Bruce and then Wendy.
I'll support that.
Wendy?
So I understand where Salim is coming from, and I'm thinking about all the conversations I've had this past 10 days about steep slopes in critical areas and smaller building pads and rooftop decks, again, being the only possibility. So can I open a suggestion that maybe we say rooftop railings may not extend above the maximum allowed height for the main structure unless the building is on a steep slope or in a critical area? So that limits rooftop decks or living rooms or railings, whatever you want to call it, to only being considered by Evan and his team if the property has extenuating circumstances in those unique situations, which I think both of our speakers tonight were referencing. Because building in a critical area on a slope, there are a whole bunch of things you have to do to make that work anyway, and when you don't have much dirt for lawns and kids to play, you need a little outdoor space to sit outside, and a little balcony might not do it on the second floor. So if this council's at all interested in giving a couple homeowners that might need this space in the next 18 months before our Planning Commission could get to it, we might be talking about 2 or 3 homeowners, but those 2 or 3 homeowners are really putting a lot of effort into the design and consideration of their neighbors, and really just need a little bit of outdoor space. So is there any interest in making an exception for steep slopes or critical areas?
So we have a motion on the table. and it has been seconded. So would you be moving to amend
Yes,
the existing motion
please.
to exclude steep slopes and critical
Steep
areas?
slopes or critical areas, as Evan could maybe more articulately, or maybe Dan, help me out here, give us a little bit of wiggle room for the homeowners that are in the middle of design and ready to permit, and it's 2 or 3 or 5, given that this doesn't happen very often because most of us have outdoor space and are conforming and complying with the RDS.
So I believe the amendment would make the most sense if you said steep slopes and buildings that are constrained by critical area buffers, which would pick up wetlands and watercourse buffers. We have
So could you please repeat that steep slope, constrained by?
constrained by steep slopes and critical area buffers, which would pick up wetland and watercourse buffers, and presuming you adopt the new critical area ordinance, steep slope buffers.
And that meets the spirit of what the Planning Commission was working on. It meets the spirit of our waiting to see how the RDS plays out, and it gives you some flexibility to
Would it
accommodate odd properties.
Would it be useful for the council if I read back what I think the motion might be, just based on, we had a little bit of a back and forth exchange, or perhaps look to the clerk to do that?
So you're talking about the potential amendment,
Yes.
okay?
I think before you continue discussing it, you need a second in order to validate the discussion.
Okay, do we have a second? I'll second it for the sake of discussion.
Just for clarity, are we talking about a second on the original amendment, or original motion?
Second to the,
No, you're
to the
talking-
amendment.
Second to the amendment.
Oh, okay, but it wasn't,
So-
it doesn't actually really have language yet.
Councilmember Bassett and Weaker, but you both withdrew your motion and your
Correct.
second. And then Councilmember Anderall made a motion that was seconded by Councilmember Wong to approve the ordinance in its entirety and then remand it back to the PC
Right.
for review, or the Planning Commission for review.
Right.
So that's where we're at. Now we have Wendy's proposed amendment to Councilmember Anderall's motion.
Seconded by Bruce.
Or by the,
Well, it was seconded by me, but
Mayor.
what I heard then was that we needed to have clarification, that we needed to have, that I'm stuck between which comes first, and it probably doesn't matter at the end of the day, the clarification on exactly what the language is, or the second. And I will offer whatever I need to offer so that we can get the clarification on what the amendment would read.
yeah.
So-
We
so-
need the language of the.
We need the
amendment.
language, which is what we're trying to get to, is the language of the amendment that Wendy has proposed.
You want me to read it? You have it?
I believe I have it.
Okay.
So I believe you're recommending that we amend, again, on my copy, page 8 of AB 5568, line 15, to add the words at the end of the sentence, unless the building is on a steep slope or within a critical area buffer.
And I will second it for sake of discussion.
I want to speak.
Bruce and then Benson?
I'll support that.
Benson?
I'm not going to support it. I'm a little troubled by trying to craft the legislation from the dais. I think this is something that, obviously, in the preceding 20 minutes of our discussion, there was a lot of different scenarios, different factors that people wanted to be considered, and I just think it's not the right way to craft something that is as important as this thing. And I realize that there are homeowners out there that are looking for some direction at this point, but I'm a little nervous about trying to craft something that is specific to particular homeowners. I mean, that's what the discussion has been. I'm a little nervous about that, and I think we're better served if we craft legislation that applies to the whole island, and then, obviously, through the Councilmember Enroll's motion that I seconded, gives direction to the Planning Commission to come back, and the staff to come back with specific variances or exceptions to that general rule. So I'm going to vote against the amendment.
Dave?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that we're getting to a bit of a beauty contest on whose idea is the best, and so I think Benson's suggestion is a good one, that we probably to try and craft the legislation right here, top of head, is probably not the best way to do it, so I agree that it gets sent back to the Planning Commission.
Okay, I think we're ready for a vote on the amendment then. All in favor of the amendment which references steep slopes and critical area buffers, please say aye. 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 Opposed?
Nay.
Dave? And I think you're a nay. Although it would have gone a different way.
Mayor Bertling, can we have a show of hands, please? It's a little.
Okay, so all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand and say aye.
The amendment.
The amendment, sorry, the amendment, aye. 3. All opposed? 4. All right, so the amendment fails, we're back to the original motion. Any further discussion?
Could I just ask for the language of that? Councilmember Anderal did that kind of on the fly. I just want to make sure we are clear on what that is at this point.
If I might suggest that we stick to the motion as written and then put a remand at the end of it, that might help with clarification.
I think that's all my motion was, pass the ordinance as presented to us tonight and remand it to the Planning Commission.
But you further defined, you wanted them to look at whether or not there could be exceptions, defined very specific exceptions for allowing railings above the height limit.
And with what time frame? In what time frame for the Planning Commission?
2019, I heard 2019 by.
Excuse.
Mayor, if I may,
Yes.
if I could, if that's the intent, if I could recommend that we go with a motion to approve as is, and then subsequent to that, a motion to directing staff to, either look at this specifically and bring it back with the details needed. Because the only reason I say this is because once you pass, this motion sort of has 2 actions that needs to be done. One is the approval of us right now one is the approval of the ordinance, and then the other one is a separate direction to staff that's unrelated. So the approve of, whether that second action gets done or not, this ordinance is going to go into effect, and so there might be this awkward sort of dance going on here.
What I would suggest, for the sake of clarity, for council, for the public, and for staff, would be to formalize what our Assistant City Attorney has just said. Council Member Anderal, would you be comfortable reading the motion specifically as you would like to have it voted on? Which would be page 2 of the agenda bill. And then the recommendation from our Assistant City Attorney is, as a second action, apart from passing or not this motion, we would then remand further action to the Planning Commission to separate the 2.
I think that's fine. I think that's fine. I think BO makes a good point. You don't want the effectiveness of the ordinance to be conditional on subsequent action being taken or not taken, so I think that's legitimate. So I would, may I withdraw my prior motion and move to adopt ordinance number 19C-04, amending Title 19 Mercer Island Code to clarify development standards and this whole part of it here, we didn't talk about this.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we first, we still need to, you have remanded, or you have withdrawn your motion.
I need.
And we need a
Councilmember-
second.
I need Councilmember Wong to withdraw his second as well.
Yes.
I withdraw my second.
Okay. So this then gives us the opportunity to move to a clean slate, which would be the motion, and I understand that you're processing the 2 parts to the motion right now.
Yeah, I didn't realize we had the renaming in there.
Can I
We
make a
can talk
motion?
about that, but.
Whoever wants to get to the,
Okay,
All right,
I
Salim's
move
going.
to adopt ordinance number 19C-04, amending Title 19 MICC to clarify development standards and rename the Development Services Group to Community Planning and Development Department.
first and seconded, is there any discussion? Seeing none, we're going to go ahead and vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Dave, you want to vote?
If it's unanimous,
It's the original motion.
4, yes.
Aye. All right, and none in favor, motion passes. All right, now we're moving on to the element of remanding back to the Planning Commission any work on clarifying rooftop decks. What I'm hearing that was, I thought was fairly consistent was that it was exceptional circumstances, meaning that there was something about the slope, or it was about the critical area buffers as a starting point, that was something that the council was interested in. First, is that correct? And then, is there anything else we would put in addition?
Just for clarification, it's really the rooftop railings, not the deck. The deck, there's no prohibition about having a rooftop deck. It's just the railings exceeding the.
But you can't have a rooftop deck without a railing, is what I've heard. That's what we covered when I gave my example.
I think it's whether a rooftop railing is an appurtenance or not. And so
We got to figure this one out.
we don't really, because if it's, to Benson's point, a discussion about rooftop railings being appurtenances, and in only certain circumstances is what you're asking to remand. The deck is allowed.
But the deck is not allowed without a railing, is what I heard from Evan from a safety perspective.
As a living space, meaning it can be accessible as a flat roof.
Yeah, do you need a formal motion for this, or is it enough for us to?
Say good
just
luck?
sort of, yeah, say we're looking for limited circumstances under which the railing would be permitted, which I think I've heard general consensus on that. So I'm
So-
trying to get us there without getting to language.
I think I understand the question the council is asking the planning commission to review. So I don't think, unless there's something new outside of your conversation so far, I don't think I need additional clarification. What would help me is if there was consensus on timing. If
Okay,
it's
I'm just going to
2019 or
also, but I did, in order to make sure, I'm going to look at Chair Hubble, and I believe we have Vice Chair in the back? Yep, we do. You guys are comfortable? Yeah, we can get it done. Okay, so now you just need to know what our hopes and expectations are for timing. Council, thoughts?
2019. yeah, soon.
2019.
2019? All right, I'm hearing consensus, so adding it to the 2019 work schedule. All right. Council, I think we are now done after over an hour of discussion on a consent.
On the consent.
Okay, now we're going to get into the substance of the evening. Next on our agenda, we have the next item of regular business, which is AB 5559, Arch 2019 Administrative Budget and Work Program. And I do want to say again, a sincere thanks to all of you who were able, particularly our Planning Commission members who were able to help guide us through that previous conversation. So with that, we welcome Allison Van Gorp.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to mention that Lindsay Masters, the executive manager of Arch, is here as well, so she's available if we have questions for her after my presentation. I've got about 5 or 6 slides that I wanted to go through, summarizing the information that's in the agenda bill, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. Okay, so this is an exercise we go through on an annual basis. In addition to the funding that's allocated through the city's budget process biannually, each year we come back to approve the administrative budget and work program for Arch. It goes to all of the member city councils on an annual basis. So the administrative budget funds Arch staff and operations as is laid out in the work program, which we'll talk about in a few moments. The budget this year is $724,000 total, which is a 3.5% increase over last year, 3.5% increase over last year. Mercer Island is being asked to contribute 4.6% of that total, or $33,327. And that allocation is based on our population. It's a per capita calculation. I also wanted to mention, typically at this time of year when we adopt the work plan and budget, we also would be taking action to allocate Housing Trust Fund dollars to specific projects. When the funding round occurred last fall in 2018, there was only one project proposed and it was later withdrawn. Basically, it was not ready for funding at that point. And so we're in an unusual circumstance this year that there are no recommended projects coming forward. And so the council does not need to allocate funds to any projects this year from that fall 2018 funding round. The money that the city contributed to the Housing Trust Fund in 2018 will remain in the trust fund for future allocation to projects. We're anticipating several projects coming forward during this year's funding round this fall. And whatever projects are recommended by the Citizen Advisory Board and the Executive Board of Arch will come back to the council next year for funding allocation. With that, I wanted to jump into a little overview of the Arch Work Program. This is consistent with the type of work they've been doing with us for many years. It falls into 5 main areas. First, Arch works with potential affordable housing projects to provide technical assistance, to help applicants coordinate with other public and private funders, to put together the many layers of funding and financing that are required in an affordable housing project. It's typically quite complex and can take a couple of years to put those packages together and move them forward through the various grant programs and other applications. So Arch provides technical assistance to some of the agencies pursuing those projects to help them get off the ground. The second work area is working on a housing policy and planning. And this is both working with each of the member cities on policy and programs within each city, as well as the interlocal and regional and state work that they do to coordinate between our cities and with regional agencies and on state legislative activities. I'll talk a little bit more in a few moments about the specific activities Arch is working on with the City of Mercer Island. And then the third area in the work program is the housing program implementation. So this is the monitoring and oversight of the actual housing units, the rental units and the homeownership units that are created through both the Housing Trust Fund program and through incentive and requirement programs that the cities might have. So Arch coordinates with each of those cities and the various buildings that are created within the cities to monitor those units on an ongoing basis. The fourth area of the work plan is education and outreach. So Arch hosts public events. They provide information to the public and folks that are seeking affordable housing. They engage with communities and help to just broaden understanding of their affordable housing efforts in general. The fifth area is administration. So basically maintaining the administration of all of Arch's programs and services, and then kind of the back end of their programs. So in addition to those 5 basic areas, the executive board has laid out 4 priority objectives for this year. First and foremost on that list is strengthening program administration and monitoring functions. Lindsay talked about this at your meeting 2 weeks ago. They're going through this auditing process and looking for a series of recommendations that they can bring forward on how to improve based on some of the work that's been happening this year. The second one is coordinating and facilitating transit-oriented development projects on public land. So looking for opportunities to use surplus public lands to create additional transit-oriented development projects. The fourth area is developing proposals for dedicated revenue sources for affordable housing. So looking for ways to create that dedicated revenue stream that will provide consistent and ongoing funding for Arch and for other affordable housing needs. And the final one is pursuing strategies to increase access to housing by underserved communities. They've been starting to see that there's certain communities and demographics that aren't able to access the housing as well as others, and they're looking to coordinate with other agencies and communities to provide additional outreach to those communities. Okay, so this is the list of specific work items that are included in the work plan that refer to Mercer Island. And so these items this list is created each year through a collaboration of Arch staff and our staff and CPD. This year on the list, we've got 5 items. So first is we're asking Arch to assist us with reviewing the city's multifamily tax exemption program and looking at potentially adding options for fee in lieu alternatives for our land use requirements. Currently, for buildings in town center, if they want to achieve the full height, they must include a certain percentage of affordable units. And there's been some interest in potentially allowing those projects to pay a fee in lieu rather than providing those units on site. So that's something that we would like to explore this year. The second item is assisting the city with the housing strategy plan. And so this has been a long-term objective that we would like to start to look at in advance of our next comp plan update. So looking at having a more comprehensive housing strategy to address all the housing needs of our community. As needed, assist city staff with components of residential development standards that are associated with housing stock diversity. So we've had some discussions with Planning Commission and even at the council of looking at different proposals on creating opportunities or pilot projects for different kinds of housing types within our city. So this was kind of a placeholder for any of those conversations that may come forward this year or in the future. Again, as needed, Arch would work with city staff on administering affordable housing provisions associated with our land use incentive and the MFTE programs in town center. So that's kind of the monitoring and oversight and administration of the units that are created there. And then the last item is related to this as well. As potential project proposals come forward, Arch staff can work with us and with the project proponents to help them understand what the housing requirements mean for their specific project. How many units would they need to create? What kind of rents could they charge, et cetera? And then there's the development of a covenant that would help to enforce that once the project moves forward. Okay, so I've got a recommended motion, but we're open for questions and discussion.
Wendy.
Thank you for that. I'm just curious how many jurisdictions use that fee in lieu rather than implementing affordable housing units within new development?
I'm going to ask Lindsay if she can help me answer that. I know there's a variety of ways that cities deal with this.
I can think of at least 3 that have used that option. Kirkland, Redmond, and I believe Bellevue as well. Typically, it is not allowed as a matter of a right that a developer has to select that, but it's more at the city's discretion they allow it. There's one exception I know of in Kirkland where there's a small fraction of a unit that might be required, they would allow a payment to be made instead. But I think it is something that increasingly is being looked at as an option and as a strategy to get the most efficiency out of those programs and to be able to create the most number of units.
All right, I've got a couple questions then.
And I do too. I'm sorry, I didn't get my hand up. But.
Okay. So the first point being assist with review of the city's MFTE program and evaluating options for fee in lieu alternative. I'm actually focused on the first portion of that sentence. So I had forwarded to yourself and our planning director some questions about our existing multifamily tax exemption. From what I understand, there has not been a single development that has taken advantage of it.
Correct.
So what I'm assuming then is that this would comprise first and foremost probably an education for our council and for the public as to what it is, and then trying to assess, or in parallel assessing, why there's been a lack of interest in it. Is that generally?
That's correct, yeah.
And that would be this year?
I believe so.
Because it says 2019 work program specific to Mercer Island. I just want to be realistic in terms of the timeline that you have.
You want to help me out, Evan? I know that this work program with Arch was created probably a little in advance of when our actual CPD work plan was finalized, so I'm not sure how well they're aligning.
Yeah, I think that's correct on both accounts, Mayor, in terms of the question. Effectively, we have an MFTE program. We've had it for a number of years. We've had no participation. That usually signals there may be a challenge with the program. And so this was one of the items we flagged as needing further assistance from Arch. That would have occurred, I believe, right around the turn of the year before we had our current work plan fully developed. So whether it actually, that work takes place in 2019, which was our initial plan, or perhaps bleeds into 2020 as things get modified on our plate, I couldn't say at the moment.
Okay, great. Lisa?
Okay, I have two questions that are kind of completely unrelated, but, and it's just kind of going down the list under the Mercer Island Work Plan. It says assist city with a housing strategy plan. Can you describe what a housing strategy plan is, whether it's required by law, what sort of a timeline, whether we have one now and we're just modifying it? Kind of just flesh that out a little bit more for me.
Well, our current comprehensive plan has a housing element, which is meeting our basic GMA requirement to plan for the housing needs of our community, in short. But I think a housing strategy plan would be more in-depth and detailed, looking at how we provide housing for a variety of economic and income levels and different types of housing needs, from seniors, people with disabilities, all sorts of different needs that may exist in our community, and looking at, what are the real strategies to ensure that those housing units are made available here in Mercer Island.
So it's not separately legally required as long as we have a comp plan element for housing?
They would enhance what we already have, correct?
Okay, and then kind of, like I said, going back to where the funding for Arch's administrative budget comes from, I was looking at page 6 of the agenda bill, and I see that King County is also a participant in terms of cash contributions. They're the only entity that's not a city, from what I can tell. And reading the agenda bill earlier, it said that cities' contributions are allocated based on population. Can you tell me how King County's contribution, and maybe this is a question for Ms. Masters, how King County's contribution to Arch is calculated?
Yeah, I'll ask Lindsay if she can answer that. I don't know the answer.
Is it population of unincorporated King County?
That is my best guess. I do have to say that's a guess. I wasn't here when we did the calculations for the 2019 budget, but the unincorporated areas of East King County are part of our jurisdiction, so I would imagine we are counting that population.
Okay, well, I was just curious because when I researched the population of unincorporated King County today, I found that there were approximately 245,000 residents in unincorporated King County, which is about 10 times what's in Mercer Island. And so the question that I had is, how does, King County's contribution, how do you reconcile that with $46,000 with Mercer Island's $32,000 or $33,000 requested contribution when Mercer Island only has 1/10 of the population?
We can follow up with you on the correct way that that's calculated. I would speculate that because Arch operates in East King County, it's based on that portion of the county's population, and that the county is working in other ways to contribute to housing needs in North and South King County.
It would be great to get that clarified, because I also have what I think I heard some months back was it was also a function of what the residential zoning and general zoning is in East King County, which I believe in some cases is high as 5 acres per lot, but I don't know, we can find out.
Great. Well, and just to kind of flesh that out a little bit, one of the other anomalies that I looked at was Woodinville, and I thought, gee, Woodinville seems like a pretty big town. And then I looked at the population of Woodinville, and it's actually pretty small, in line with the small contribution. But it turns out there are a ton of Woodinville addresses that are in unincorporated King County. And so, like I said, I'm just trying to sync all of that up, and I would love some follow-up on that.
All right, I've got a question as well, and it goes to the final point. Provide project support for town center development projects that include affordable housing. One of the interesting elements for me with regard to affordable housing that I've seen going on throughout the East Side, generally, we'll just call it the East Side, is that there have been affordable housing initiatives that have been on the properties of churches or other religious institutions. If we are designating this, I guess the bigger question is what we've designated this as town center. What role or responsibility or activity would we include such that should any one of the churches or synagogues on Mercer Island come forward and say they're interested in pursuing some affordable housing, how would we map this to that request?
Well, the reason that this was constrained to the town center area is that that's where we currently have an incentive program for affordable housing. I think if another institution or entity wanted to do some kind of a project on their property, they would first have to look at what's allowed in their existing zoning or conditional use permits, and they likely would have to make some modifications there, which would be a significant process. And then, perhaps as a part of that, we could look at ways to include incentives or requirements.
Anyone else? Because I have one final question.
Oh, and I have one too. Go ahead.
Okay, you go for it.
There's just a request to also provide us, or whoever on council wants it, the Arch interlocal agreement. I've not had a chance to look at that. If I could get a copy of that, that'd be great.
Sure. I can actually give you a hard copy right now if you'd like.
Oh, I won't have time to read it, but thank you.
No problem.
The other question is, as we're all pretty much aware, there was a lot of discussion that was going on in the state legislature this year regarding density, affordability, housing stock diversity, et cetera. On the third point, it says, as needed, assist city staff with components of residential development standards review that are associated with housing stock diversity. My thinking went to, oh my gosh, are we going to go lift what was proposed at the state legislature? And let's be honest, it was reasonably close to getting through. And looking at what that impact would be on Mercer Island, is that the intent? Is that the direction? Is that the standard? What stake in the ground would we be using against which to assess housing stock diversity?
Again, these were drafted prior to the current legislative session even beginning, I believe. So it was crafted separate from that discussion. And then I think Evan wanted to.
No, I think that's correct, Mayor. Recall that in your 2018 comprehensive plan amendments, you did have some policies around looking at other types of housing options and entitlement options. To some extent, that has been characterized as aging in place and creating incentives for aging in place. That is something that I think we would want a housing planner to advise us on as the Planning Commission takes that up. We're anticipating, so moving up even a bullet from there, the housing strategy plan, there was a set of questions a moment ago, which I'll just touch on. We need to be able to show the state that we are moving forward on implementing our housing element. One of the ways we show how we're carrying those policies forward is through a strategy plan that describes our approach long-term. I think some of the legislation, that we saw at the state level this past spring was likely driven by a perception that cities aren't actively pursuing their housing element policies. So what this housing strategy plan does is it describes how Mercer Island is planning to do that. One component of that may be looking at this pilot program idea that was floated last year. There may be other components to that. Should we look at our town center regulations? Should we look at MFTE? Should we look at affordable housing fee in lieu? Things of that nature.
Great, thanks. Benson.
Before we get to the motion, can staff or city manager provide us an update on the processing of the change in HB 1406 and what does that look like? And so obviously, frankly, it's great news, I think, for small cities like Mercer Island as far as providing a source of funds for the Housing Trust Fund. But if you can just elaborate on that.
Thank you for bringing that up, Councilmember Wong. So this is a legislation that the legislature adopted this session, and basically what it provides is for cities to actually use an already existing tax. It's a sales tax that's collected by the state, but that we could take a portion of that councilmatically, and that can be devoted to affordable housing. So your taxes aren't going up. You're basically, instead of having that tax that's collected go to the state. It actually can go to your city, provided that it is going for affordable housing. And that is something the Arch Board is looking at. I believe the law becomes effective July 1. The council would want to, if you're interested, adopt a resolution stating your intent to do that. And then within, I think you have to act pretty quickly. Within 12 months, you have to adopt that legislation. And again, it's not a new tax. Everyone's already paying it. It's just, instead of it being collected and going to state coffers, it would go to us. And if we don't do it, that's fine. It's going to go to King County for the same purposes. Does that make sense? So no matter what, there's that ability. As you know, the state was really grappling this session. Last session, it was McCleary. This session, it was all about affordable housing. And so this is their attempt to really help cities like Arch cities that are already devoted to providing affordable housing with actual funding to do that. So we estimate something like $35,000 a year. And right now you're roughly allocating about $50,000 per year in this biennial. So it's roughly, pretty almost equivalent. So it's a pretty sizable amount. And I think collectively the Arch cities would collect, I think, 1.5. So, it is something I think we want to really examine. And while you already have a lot on your work plan, this is funding that you can use towards your Arch contribution. So I would really advise you to do it.
To the capital or to the operating?
Well, it is mainly for constructing affordable housing, but there is a provision, I think, in there for preserving affordable housing as well. So.
And there's no supplanting language?
There is none. So, but be careful of that, because they could always amend that. But yeah, there isn't any supplanting language, but obviously the need for affordable housing just will continue to grow. So I recommend, I know I won't be here, but that you somehow squeeze time on your very, very busy work plates to consider this legislation.
So is that something that we would put on the planning schedule, at our planning session? That would be the appropriate time? Okay.
When you say planning schedule, you mean the one in June? Or you mean
I'm sorry, the one in June, just to tee it up. I mean, it's.
Okay. Bruce, sorry.
Thank you. I'd move to approve the Arch 2019 administrative budget and work program and authorize expenditure of $33,327 for Mercer Island's contribution to the 2019 Arch administrative budget.
Second.
I'll just briefly say then, as the maker of the motion, if I might, that Arch is a entity that obviously has hit a rough patch in terms of its publicity recently with the program, I can't use the right words here, but there's clearly some work that Arch needs to do to make sure that it is fully monitoring the housing units that it has, and we should expect that that will be taken care of this year. But with that aside, it is serving a function for us that we are legally obliged to fill, and doing it in a way collaboratively with our neighbors that makes it very cost efficient for us to be doing it in the manner that we're doing it. So I'm supportive. I think we all should be glad that we have Arch as a way to meet this obligation and need for our community. And I certainly support us continuing to be supportive of it.
Lisa.
Yeah, I'm still a little bit rusty on the parliamentary procedure, so I don't know if I'm going to make a motion to amend the motion or just make a comment and see if there's a support here. But I would be in favor of postponing or tabling the consideration of contribution to the Arch budget, administrative budget. I feel like we've heard a number of things over the past couple of weeks that make me question whether this is the right way to spend the citizens of Mercer Island's money. We are still projected to be in a deficit sometime this year. We do not have assurances that the internal controls are in place for Arch. We have heard that the work plan is, for Mercer Island is not necessarily synced up with what could be accomplished this year. And I have a big question with regard to the equitability of the contributions, given the contribution from King County and the relative populations. I just don't think we have enough information to make a fiscally responsible decision today.
Yep.
So you have the interlocal, but Ally just sent it to us, and I just read it. It appears, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but our interlocal requires us to give 12 months' notice of withdrawal by 12/31 of any given year, and that would put us on the calendar cycle of the full following year. So at best, if there was an intention of this council to not partner with Arch, we would need to notify you by the end of the year, which would then put us with Arch all the way through 2020 is my reading of the interlocal. And that within the interlocal, we are obligated to make the operating payment. There is no obligation to make the a trust fund payment, but we're not being asked to. So I know not having the benefit of the interlocal, you didn't see that, but.
I just skimmed it myself. I got it as well. I don't
So
find
I wouldn't want to contractually get us in hot water, given our.
I couldn't
program
find
staff.
anything in the interlocal that described how the administrative budget is to be funded, whether the issue about whether it's proportional by population. I couldn't find it, but it's very small print and it's a long agreement.
Could either our staff or could Lindsay, would you be able to help us out?
Honestly, I'm not sure that the interlocal.
We need you at the microphone. Thank you.
I have it pulled up there. I have a hard copy.
Yeah, I don't. My memory of the interlocal agreement is that it doesn't prescribe exactly how to deal with the issues about population in an unincorporated King County and things like that. So I'm guessing it's been interpreted over the years. Unless you see something that I've missed.
I'm skimming, but yeah, I don't so far.
I think I'd look to our Assistant City Attorney then for the other element of it, which is whether or not just confirming the Deputy Mayor's reading in terms of were we to, I don't know, withdraw, withhold, freeze the administrative, what would be the options that we have?
Well, I'm sorry, but I have not reviewed the interlocal agreement with Arch. But if there is, if there's a dispute of a legal requirement as far as funding is concerned, then my best guess is there would be a dispute resolution procedure that's included in the interlocal agreement that would be triggered. But this, having not reviewed the interlocal agreement, I'm just not prepared to answer that question. My apologies.
Well, I'm going to speak in favor of the motion, and I think at this point, Arch has been historically doing tremendous work. Clearly, we know that there have been some questions that have been out there in the public. We've also heard some very concrete steps that are being taken to make sure that there are appropriate compliance clauses in there. Withholding an administrative contribution at this point, to me, does not seem like a constructive way to help Arch do the internal work that it needs to do in terms of its cleaning up its house, so to speak, but equally in terms of helping us achieve that work plan, whether it's specifically that work plan, from January through December, or whether it's starting today for the next 12 months, slowing down the work that Arch needs to do, that we are dependent, and the East Side is dependent on doing, given the need for affordable housing, 244,000 units, I believe, by 2040, if I understand correctly, doesn't seem proportional. So I think if we want to have Arch come back and talk to us about their progress, which I think we've already asked for, I'm more than comfortable, but right now withholding the $33,000 doesn't seem to contribute to them helping get their house in order. Instead, it would seem generally punitive to Arch, as well as perhaps sending the wrong message to the state, to other people that would like to see Mercer Island, as well as every other East Side community, contribute to addressing the Affordable Housing Initiative. So I'm very much in favor of making sure that Arch has its administrative budget from Mercer Island.
And I would just say I wasn't recommending denying it. I was recommending tabling it or suspending it or postponing it until we could get some answers to the questions that were raised tonight, which we do not have answers to. I don't think there would be any harm in that.
Benson?
No, I'm just going to, we have a motion that's been seconded. And so Councilmember Anderall did not make a motion, so I'd like to proceed with.
With the vote?
Yeah.
All right, so we will do. All in favor of the motion as read, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Motion passes 6-1. Thank you. Thank you. So, Council, we're coming up at 9 o'clock. We still have at least primarily the first quarter financial results, and then we have a pretty substantial piece of work with regard to the critical areas, shoreline master program, SEPA, et cetera. I know that council's going to need a break. I also know that you are going to lose me and Councilmember Wong at 9:30. So we have a choice of going ahead and moving through this first quarter financial review right now and then taking a break when we finish that, or 9:30, or we can take a break now. You want
Do the finances.
Okay, we're going to go to finance. We're not going to. All right, so Chip, you're up, and I would say you have an unofficial 30 minutes.
And it's not even 10 o'clock.
I'm going for the short version. Given the lateness of the hour, I'm cutting to the chase.
The standard script.
I'm just going to highlight a few things. Is that okay?
Yeah. Welcome.
Okay. Big picture. The first quarter report is really about the general fund and REIT. On general fund, here's an actual versus budget comparison. You'll see total revenues are at 16.6% of budget. That is actually normal. Why? Property tax. That's most of our revenues. They come in April, May, about 50% then, and another 50% in October, November. So at first quarter, we haven't quite gotten that big hit of property tax yet. Expenditures, they're right where I'd expect them to be, just a hair above the 25% threshold. And remember, we do a biweekly payroll, and we've had 7 biweekly payrolls through the year, and there's 26 for the year, and so that's 26.9%. So this is typical. If you compare actuals to actual, 19 to 18, you'll see that total revenues are down $250,000. That's about 4.6%. Why? That's about development-related revenues down 14%. Recreation and rental fees down $82,000. That's an anomaly. It'll work itself out later this year. And then utility taxes are down 3.6%. Total expenditures, note, they are flat first quarter to first quarter. And it's kind of complicated. You have a combination of COLA, cost of living adjustment impact for employees, plus step increases for represented employees, causes an increase, and offset by, remember, 19 includes some service level reductions, especially in Parks and Recreation. Also, there's been some position vacancies. Let's cut to development activity. Bottom line here, this looks at building permits issued for the first quarter for 2014 through 2019. You'll see that number of permits issued for single-family residential is down 35%, okay? If you look at all building permit types, it's down almost 39%. So if you just look at the bars here in 19, and very roughly, they're still a little bit below 14 and 15. So it's quite a bit of a drop. Let's look at activity in terms of building valuation. This should get your attention. It's down 40% for single-family residential, or 41% for all building permit types. 19 really corresponds to 2014 in terms of valuation. Now, I haven't had a chance to visit with Evan to get the latest and greatest, but we were expecting this kind of for the first half of the year. There's stuff that's going on, but we haven't gotten permit revenue yet, and construction hasn't begun yet, so we expect things to pick up in the second half of the year. REIT. This is, let's look at actuals, the second bullet point. First quarter of 19 versus first quarter of last year. Down almost $100,000, that's 12.5%. Why? Number of property sales are down almost 12%. Average sales price is up about 3%, now at $1.55 million. Just a little perspective, the first quarter of 2018 was an anomaly. There actually was a robust number of sales as first quarters go, which are normally very, very slow. And so we're comparing to an unusually robust quarter. Also, you had the the snow events, right, which slow down sales, and just the fact that it's always the first quarter is usually slow. So it's too early to form a judgment and to reforecast REIT. Let's see how the next quarter goes, and when I come back to the council in September with the second quarter financial status report, I'll provide you with an updated REIT forecast. And remember, whenever there's a sale of a major commercial property, which is more likely under the current economic conditions where things are at a really high level in terms of property value, that makes up the difference very quickly in terms of a reduced number of sales. Budget adjustments. The budget amending ordinance is attached as Exhibit 2. All that's contained in there, you've already approved, you've already bought off on back on April 2nd and April 30th, if memory serves me. You have two categories. You have the deficit spending reductions for the general fund. You approved those on April 2nd, and then the deficit spending reductions for the YFS fund. We got that squared away on April 30th. And then finally, some other budget adjustments. Provide a little perspective real quickly on the deficit spending reductions. For the general fund, they total, and it's mostly service level reductions or expenditure reductions with a little bit of enhanced revenues, $1.34 million for the 1920 biennium. I break it down there for you by year, so $428,000 in 19, $913,000 in 2020. To rebalance each year, what we do is, remember, 19, how we needed one-time money to balance 19. We needed a little over $1 million. It was transferred from the contingency fund to the general fund. Well, with these reductions in our 1920 budget, we can reduce that interfund transfer by the same amount, $428,000. Okay? To balance 2020, it's a little bit different. I needed almost $800,000 in just cash fund balance to balance 2020. With the reductions in 2020 totaling $913,000, I don't need that $800,000. So it frees it up. You with me? We get to disappropriate it, if you will, is what happens. YFS fund, big picture, is we are eliminating the $309,000 general fund support that's budgeted in 2020. To accomplish that, you have a combination of things, $130,000 in expenditure reductions, $124,000 in new enhanced revenues, and the balance, $55,000 of just available fund balance in the fund. Other budget adjustments, there's just two. There's the funding the additional soil remediation costs for our next door neighbor site there, the Honeywell property. And so the allocation is based on 2019 budgeted fleet M&O costs. And so 74% of it comes from the general fund. And then you'll see correspondingly about 12% from water, 6% from sewer, and 8% from stormwater is how it all breaks out. That all funnels into the equipment rental or fleet fund, which is where we account for these costs. And then finally, restoring the elementary school counselors and an admin assistant. This is just slightly different than what we talked about in terms of numbers. We talked about 170,000, it's really 173. Just to do a little bit of cleanup work here. So to restore those things, the first elementary school counselor for September of this year through December of next year, that's $122,000. The second elementary school counselor in the second year of the biennium, so September 2020 through December 2020 is $35,000, and then the admin assistant, for the second half of this year, $16K. That's your $173,000. That brings us to our council action, and happy to answer any questions you have.
Yeah. Salim.
Hey, is there anything that you can do to report around the funnel of residential permits? Like what we see is applicants by year, but what we don't really know is how are they converting and percent complete. So, and since you can hold a permit for 2 years and then have an extension, there's a pipeline or a funnel that can be building up, compressing, which we don't have visibility into. I'm just wondering, as you go into that discussion with Evan, if there's any way to get visibility about the backlog.
I'll check.
Thanks.
Good question.
Council, any additional questions?
I had one, if you don't mind. This was more, Chip, around the year end from the last time you reported out. And I don't have the language in front of me, but I recall there being some discussion about a surplus funds being allocated to various capital funds, or surpluses being kind of put into various boxes. And since we finished 2018 with a surplus, I'm just kind of, and you can correct me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, I'm just kind of wondering who makes those decisions? Is there specific council guidance to you about where surplus monies go and when? and in what proportion? And I'm sorry to surprise you with this, it's
no,
just
it's
been
not
in the back
surprise.
of my mind.
It's okay. So just for the benefit, when there are surpluses, it's usually we're talking about general fund, disposition of that surplus, and any surplus REIT, which it's already been disposed of. It's already been allocated, is what I should say. So general fund surplus, we will come back to the council. I'm guessing I need to talk to the mayor and deputy mayor. We talked about maybe September as part of the same time we bring the second quarter financial status report. We want to get some more information on the soil remediation work. But it's up to the council when we come back to you to decide how to allocate the $1.4 million. And so we're using a piece of that, okay, a little over $100,000 for soil remediation. The rest of it is unallocated at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Council, any further questions? If not, entertain a motion.
I move to suspend the City Council Rules of Procedure 6.3, requiring a second reading for an ordinance, and adopt ordinance number.
I think we'll go for one at a time.
One at a time, you can't do
Yeah.
both together? Okay.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the first motion, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes.
Okay, I further move to adopt ordinance number 19-09, amending the 2019-2020 budget.
Say. First and second, any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, motion passes.
Mayor,
Thanks.
Yes.
could we clarify who made the motion, who
We're
made
going
the
to give it to
second?
Benson. Benson made the motion, I think Bruce.
No.
I mean, sorry.
I
Lisa made the,
move-
and you made the second.
Thank you.
My
Thank you.
mistake. All right, council. Do you want to take a break now?
Yeah.
All right, we will take a break until 9:15.
Thank you.
So I'm going to leave you out.
Yeah, I think I may as well.
Great, thank you for everybody rejoining us back up here with a smaller crowd, but more effective. Our third item of regular business is Agenda Bill 5566, Planning Commission's recommendations for critical areas code, shoreline master program, SEPA, and ancillary amendments, first reading. Welcome Senior Planner Robin Probsting.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Council. I'm Robin Probsting, one of your senior planners, and tonight, together with Dan Hubble, Chair of the Planning Commission, and Tiffin Goodman, Vice Chair of the Planning Commission, we've prepared a brief introductory presentation to the Critical Areas Ordinance and Shoreline Master Program update. What we're hoping to cover this evening is first an overview of the scope of this code update and some context behind what was required to be addressed as part of this update. Second, what the process was of getting from point A to point B, how we got from the existing code that's in the code currently to the code that's in front of you tonight. And lastly, a review of the contents of your agenda bill and to answer any questions that you may have about those materials. So I'll start by reviewing the legislative framework for the Critical Areas Ordinance and Shoreline Master Program. So these are two unfunded mandates that come from two different acts of state legislation. The requirements for the Critical Areas Code come from the Growth Management Act, which requires cities and counties to do three things. First, to identify and designate critical areas. So that means define what they are, explain how one would know if one had critical areas on one's property. Second requirement is to include the best available science into the Critical Areas Code, which needs to be based on science. So council members who attended the joint meeting with the Planning Commission last spring may recall the presentation by the city's consultant for this project, ESA, which went into the scientific literature, which formed the basis for the reasons behind their recommendations to us. They really impact, what do we know about how best to develop around critical areas, and based on that, provided scientifically backed recommendations. The last requirement is that cities are required to adopt codes to protect critical areas. That is, understanding what the ecological functions of critical areas are and to ensure that the city has standards to protect those. So the key takeaway here is that critical areas ordinances need to be based on science. The code needs to protect critical areas, and those are both requirements of state law. The other major component of this project is the Shoreline Master Program. Shoreline Master Programs are a component of the Shoreline Management Act and are a set of regulations that apply in areas within 200 feet of the shoreline of Lake Washington. Periodic reviews are required on a timeline set by state law, and Mercer Island's next periodic review is due in June of 2019, so next month. Since the city's existing Shoreline Master Program was adopted in 2015, which was a significant effort, it was a multi-year effort, this review is kept really limited in scope. The changes made to the Shoreline Master Program were primarily made to keep the city's SMP consistent with state law. The Shoreline Master Program is a little different from other regulations in that local Shoreline Master Programs implement standards that the Department of Ecology has authority over. So Ecology has final authority over the city's Shoreline Master Program. And so to coordinate that review, the way the update will work with the SMP is the local jurisdiction sends a draft of the code to the Department of Ecology. Ecology staff reviews the draft and provides what's called an initial determination of consistency, which city has obtained. It's in your packet, Exhibit 9. And it contains a list of changes that are required in order for Ecology to accept the city's SMP and which are required before final adoption. So once the City Council has adopted the SMP, we transmit that to Ecology, and the Department of Ecology will send its final determination of consistency. So those two major legislative requirements, the Growth Management Act and the Shoreline Management Act, are the basis for updating these portions of the city's code. They provide the basis for what we need to do. And I'll just observe these two code updates are a little different from other types of code updates in that there's a more defined framework for what's required to be addressed and how. This was not really a wide open kind of process where there's a full range of options. It's more that these two topics specifically, critical areas and shoreline regulations, have this really defined legislative framework that the city has to work within. So are there any questions so far on legislation that I can help with?
Yeah, if I may. I'll call myself. Can you tell me why Ecology has this two-step determination? So they've already given us the initial determination of consistency, but when I assume the council does the second reading or first read, passes this, it would go back to Ecology for that final determination? Is that
correct? And so
why do they have that mechanism there?
I guess I'm not sure why they chose to set up the rules that way, but a thought would be that it gives cities a chance to get feedback and choose to incorporate it. I see my boss creeping up on me as an answer. But there's a round of exchange. I'm sure my director knows Ecology's rules better. Please.
Well, he knows me pretty well too. So the reason I'm asking is it possible that they contemplate that a council or through this kind of legislative process, there might be a small change to the SMP, that they would then have the process around kind of recertifying that kind of at this stage?
Yeah, and it does work both ways in my experience, Deputy Mayor. So we occasionally have council action that would be inconsistent with the Shoreline Management Act that Ecology would want to weigh in on and really act a little bit as a gatekeeper prior to implementation, which is why they have kind of last word on this. But much more commonly is making sure that we've met the test in terms of documentation to Ecology on how our standards are consistent with the Shoreline Management Act. So Robin perhaps didn't take credit for a bulk of work that she just completed between the Planning Commission's recommendation to you, which occurred at the end of April and, in April, and the initial determination of consistency that we received from Ecology, which required that we essentially package up a whole bunch of data and technical reports to the Department of Ecology to document how our Shoreline Master Program and the critical areas that would be incorporated into that Shoreline Master Program are consistent with the Shoreline Management Act.
So it's not inconceivable that if something snuck in that wasn't that impactful, that Ecology would have a process to review that prior to our SMP falling out of compliance?
That's correct. It is important, I'm anticipating that you may be considering some change to the SMP. And if the council decides to do that, there are a couple nuances just to make sure you're aware of. We have not prepared at this time a cumulative impact analysis, which is required when we do a major update to the Shoreline Master Program. Major update in this context would be a substantive change to the existing standards outside of what the periodic update would require. So let me parse that out a little bit further because I've thrown a lot of words at you. The periodic update, so the update that we've currently scoped for, was really looking at changes in statute or case law between your last adoption, 2015, and today, and documenting how those are either addressed already in the Shoreline Management Program, Shoreline Master Program, or amending text to address those. A more substantive change might be to say, we're going to allow every dock on the island to extend 150 feet out into the lake, purely hypothetical. That kind of change to the shoreline regulations is viewed in the entirety of the shoreline protections. So we prepare what's termed a cumulative impact analysis. We look at the specific change and the protection of the shoreline as a whole with that specific change contemplated. That's a technical document that we would likely retain our consultant to prepare. We would package that into the material that we send to the Department of Ecology. It likely would require their kind of further analysis and blessing, and then presumably they could accept it. Does that make sense?
It does, and so I don't want to hijack the presentation, but Evan, maybe you could think about that uncoupling statement and the scale and magnitude of that while we continue on.
May I just follow up on that?
Yeah.
Is a second, just to cut to the chase of what the recommendation is a second reading on June 4th and adoption going to give enough time for you to go back to ecology? I mean, is that the timing? Do you have to get the final concurrence from ecology before or after the council enacts the ordinance?
It would come after adoption by council.
Okay, and so then if ecology didn't concur, it would just have to come back to us again?
I suppose so, and which, as Evan said, may include, depending on the nature of the change made by council, could involve extra studies like the cumulative impact analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else I can answer about what we've talked about so far? Okay. So with that, I'll hand it over to the Planning Commission Chair and Vice Chair briefly to talk about the process the Planning Commission went through before you can have your own podium.
Do we have another slide?
Yeah, we do. Yes, you do.
Who's up next?
You are. Or, I know one of you. We can talk up here.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Deputy Mayor and council members. Daniel Hubble again, Planning Commission Chair, and Tiffin Goodman will be with me shortly. I think the notes for us, from my perspective, is to talk about process and how we came to the recommendation that's before you. As has been mentioned by Ms. Probstein, we had consultants that looked at the entirety of the critical areas ordinance and the science behind those. And we looked at and reviewed and identified the gaps between the existing code, which was adopted in 2005, and where we are today in our understanding of the science. And part of the process that we went through is looking at the relevancy of the determinations of that science to Mercer Island. And in most cases, I think we've looked at and either adopted or within a certain deviation, looked at the recommendations that have come from the consultants around the science. As you know, the process goes that if you're going to deviate from that science, you have to provide adequate justification for why you're not going to do that. And in a few cases, we have deviated from the science where we've removed things, for example, that just weren't applicable to Mercer Island. We made a number of changes based on public comment. Ecology, there were a number of tribal organizations as well as residents that commented on the impacts of the science that we had here on Mercer Island or the applicability of that science. So we've taken that into consideration. There was a subcommittee that was formed that actually got into the nitty-gritty of this, and if I can remember, I mean, you guys spoke for, I think the subcommittee met for at least probably 10 or 12 hours worth of, it was 3 or 4 meetings, if not more, digging into the particulars of the critical areas ordinance. And having gone through the process of this when I was in Newcastle in 2004, when the original critical areas ordinance legislation came through the county and the state, I can tell you that the review that we've done for this update was more than what we did for the original adoption that I did in Newcastle in 2004. So I don't know if that speaks poorly for what we did then, or if it speaks highly for what we've done now, but we've done a tremendous amount of review, particularly as the subcommittee has done that. I don't even have the number here. Evan, maybe you can give me the number, or Robin. During the course of our review, I think we had a dozen or more amendments where we really refined the content of what has come to you. So from a procedural perspective, we went through chapter by chapter, looked at each piece of science, we looked at each piece of the critical areas ordinance and how it really applied in the best and most effective way to the community based on feedback and those sorts of things. So with that, we're certainly open to process. I think Tiffin, we're up on the next piece here. I think you can see on the screen, we had 16 meetings as a body as a whole. There were 3 subcommittee meetings that I know that at least extended 10 or more hours, and then there were 50 plus hours of review during those meetings that we had. So this has not been an exercise that has been done in haste. We've looked at least 2 or 3 revisions of the code through this process to get to where we are. And
You can go back, if you can.
I'll go back.
Okay. Hi, there we go. I've actually never been at this mic before. Hi, I'm Tiffin Goodman, Planning Commission. Today, I actually wanted to come talk to you a little bit more about our framework and process for making policy decisions. Early on in the process, we had a discussion like how, this was very kind of nebulous. We didn't really know where it was going to go. And we said, well, how are we going to make policy decisions that aren't sort of random? So we came up with 4 categories, decision-making categories. So property owner interest, private property owners, community interest. That would be something like overall community interest, looking at natural hazards, safety, growth, social interactions, environmental impacts, and then administration, which we actually thought was very important. We didn't want to make a code that was difficult to administer. So made sure it was clear, the objectives were clear, it was simple within the complexity that it kind of inherently has. So we had those 4 categories, and then what we did is for every policy decision we had, for example, let's take wetland buffers. The best available science maybe would come back, and I believe it sort of depends a little bit on the wetland, but say the buffer is 100 feet. So we looked at that and we said, okay, that probably is either a small positive or neutral in most of the categories, but in private property owner interest, it could actually be a large negative. We had kind of a small negative, large negative. So we said, okay, by default, we can't have any large negatives. So if that happened automatically, what we did is we went back and we said, okay, what policy recommendation can we make that actually will still fit within the science recommendation, could be justified, but will basically result in no large negatives. So in that case, that's how we ended up recommending buffer averaging and buffer reduction. So those are basically examples of how we framed our major decisions. There were many, many minor tweaks that we didn't go through this process with, but that's how we kind of came up with this framework because we didn't want to just kind of be ad hoc. We didn't want to just like throw out random ideas. We wanted to be very strict in how we looked at this to make sure that we covered all these areas. Do you have anything to add to that? Okay, do you have any, and then if there are any questions, let me know, but that was it.
I see Wendy reaching.
Well, I'm just thinking and trying to decide how to ask this question. So when we wrote the code in 2015, I know you guys weren't there, but look at that so you built off that. Did you question anything in 2015 that might have been worth revisiting? Like, I know you did the gap analysis, but tell me if there are some issues there that maybe should have been re-examined or reopened. And where I'm going with this is I'm thinking about docks on waterfront properties.
Yeah, I think any of us could answer that. I think the answer is no, we didn't go there because we didn't have the scope or the resources. And, we're on a timeline to actually get the SMP done for next month. So I think that's a short answer. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything. And I guess I would say the sort of tangential amount of information I know about it would indicate if we wanted to go there, it's a significant process. And that's fine to go there, but we weren't scoped to do that. And I was under the impression we were intentionally not scoped to kind of go that deep.
I'll take a stab if nobody else has any questions. Can you talk just a bit about that decision-making matrix as it applied to banking, the mitigation, and how that came into the process? Because I understand it was kind of intentional coming up with the banking off-island mitigation.
Correct. So,
For which part?
if I can offer it, so the decision-making framework was reserved for questions on which there was a major policy decision to be made. There were also, as Commissioner Goodman mentioned, a smaller group, or actually a rather larger group of opportunities to make the code either more clear or more consistent with the best available science. There was nothing in our code that was inconsistent, but wetland banking, for example, was one measure that our consultant offers as a way to provide more flexibility for property owners. So it was not that there was a deficit or something wrong with our code, it was just an opportunity to improve it and provide further flexibility.
And so the off-island banking, is that in the code, does it have any preference to if an on-island banking opportunity came about, that would receive preference?
Code doesn't yet distinguish, since there isn't one on island, it wasn't named in the code. It's certainly if one were to be created, the code could be amended.
Okay. So any other questions, council? So I'm just going to suggest if we can go back to you, Evan, on this SMP dock issue and maybe have at least your take on what appears to be significant public comment around the uncoupling of the decking from the structure of the dock, and if there's any way that we could incorporate some sort of change into this SMP update that might be more like our neighbors.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Mayor. So I want to acknowledge, I think there's more to the initial presentation that we should also touch through. I want to touch back to perhaps Councilmember Weiker's question a moment ago. Recall that when we scoped the body of work that we were setting forth back in really early 2018, we had a conversation, really the council had a conversation around the scope of work for the Shoreline Master Program. And at the time, I think there was some question of, do we want to open up, say, the RIA 8 guidance and look at a number of policy issues? My takeaway from that planning commission, city council discussion was that the answer was effectively no. We wanted to keep the SMP narrowly scoped, which is what I've advised your planning commission and frankly, the conversation since. So it's not that I think anyone was blind to the comments that were offered by Mr. Thomas on behalf of Perkins Coie, either during the planning commission process or tonight. And I appreciate his comments tonight, really supporting the staff clarification and then acknowledging that it is a substantive change that's being requested to your Shoreline Master Program. As far as solutions go, I think the City Council probably has a choice. One would be to say something along the lines of, we want to change this threshold, as I've described it in some of the email correspondence in response to council questions, and change that threshold perhaps as recommended by Mr. Thomas or others. To do that, I think we are probably going to need to prepare that cumulative impact analysis and have that conversation with Department of Ecology. What I would anticipate we would hear back from the Department of Ecology is that they look at our shoreline master program as a complete set of regulations. And so focusing, even though we may just want to focus on dock width for repaired docks within 30 feet of the shoreline, they're going to look at the entire body of regulations and determine whether or not there's a cumulative impact. That then generates this cumulative impact analysis that I described a few minutes ago, and frankly prolongs the discussion and changes our scope with our consultant to some extent. So it has a time and a monetary effect. And I would also observe, this is how we've described the conversation to the Planning Commission and the community to date. So you do not have the benefit of the Planning Commission in-depth analysis around the question that's really being asked by Mr. Thomas, I think, on behalf of whoever his client is. And you don't have the benefit of the community input around that question, except perhaps at the very end of the process where there was some public comment. So, but that is one alternative, to move forward with that as part of the current action. I would tend to recommend the other alternative that I'm going to lay out in a moment, which is, frankly, the approach that you used earlier this evening, which is I would recommend that you move forward with the amendments as packaged in the recommendation from your Planning Commission tonight. It's a very thorough process, very detailed, and flag this as an item that we need to follow up on. If you tell me to follow up on it in 2019, I'm probably going to want to talk about our work plan a little bit. But you know, I think it warrants, if we're going to do it, my personal recommendation would be we should do it right, which means we advertise it as a change to our Shoreline Master Program, we scope it, and then we engage the community around it. And we have not done that in this case. So those are the two options I see moving forward. I would recommend, council, it probably makes sense for us to go through the rest of the presentation to kind of get the rest of the amendments on the table. Yeah, this item has been the public comment tonight, but it's kind of a secondary issue to the rest of the package, if you will.
So one more question about that, though. And I've heard from other neighbors, not just our public speaker tonight. So lots of friends that have docks that are old that are going to be in need of repair or replacement, that have already been here and have their footprint on the water and all that. If we pass the regs as tonight, or whatever the next one is, and we look at that again, then the regs are now even more stringent. So making a change in that piece of it is that much harder after the fact, is it not?
Pardon me, Councilmember, I don't think that's accurate. So the regs as drafted in this ordinance are simply a clarification of the current substance. We have not changed that threshold. And that is one of the things I regret in some of the public comment is it was mischaracterized as a change. The current version of that code, and is perhaps not very clearly phrased. And so what we've tried to do here is simply clarify it. So to me, this is a clarification, not a substantive change. And that's why I appreciated the comments from Mr. Thomas tonight, acknowledging that it was a clarification, but without a change to the substance of that standard. I don't mean to put words in his mouth, of course. And I'm not disputing there are others that are interested in this conversation. It's more that we've tried to narrowly keep this to just what's the statute require and how can we clarify things. And so we haven't engaged in that more substantive discussion. And we haven't done some of our homework around a cumulative impact analysis.
Right, okay.
Okay, we'll circle back to that.
Thank you all for the input. I have just a couple more topics to touch on. The first is looping back on community engagement. Community engagement was also part of the scope approved by council, and sort of follow up on that. I want to review how we've done community engagement throughout the 18 months of this project. Staff used a number of different channels to reach out to the community and get input on the code. For example, there was a page on Let's Talk, which is the city's public engagement portal. And that page was continuously updated with important meeting dates, draft code language while it was in development. Yours truly made an explainer video explaining the basics and background of the project. And also at project milestones, notifications would go out via social media and MI Weekly, alerting people to upcoming meetings and project progress. Interdepartmental coordination was also an important part of this. Throughout the life of the project, CPD staff met regularly with staff from other departments, especially Parks and Public Works, to coordinate and make sure that there were no standards being proposed that could set up a conflict with those departments' work. So to avoid that situation, we met regularly, staff from those departments reviewed and provide comments on early drafts of the code, and hopefully by doing that, we've kept the city's work internally consistent. So I'm going to turn to your packet for a moment just to review what all is included and use it as a guide to walk through how the Planning Commission has followed all the legislative requirements. And following the packet, I thought would be a handy way of describing 18 months worth of work in a organized fashion. So hopefully that works. So exhibits 1 through 3 of your packet are draft ordinances. The first ordinance would repeal the existing critical areas code and replace it with the new critical areas code, together with some ancillary changes and updates to cross-references and definitions to make sure it's all internally consistent. The second ordinance would amend the Shoreline Master Program and relocate it to its own chapter within Title 19. And the third ordinance would move the city's SEPA rules from a section within Chapter 1907 and give it its own chapter as well. The reason for moving around sections of code is to hopefully make them easier to find for people who may not be familiar with our code, and thereby make it more user-friendly. Exhibit 4 is a memo from staff to council regarding compliance with the city's administrative code. So anytime the city updates its code, the update needs to meet the criteria in the code sections listed in the memo. And the memo is intended to unpack, how those criteria were met. Exhibit 5 provides a side-by-side of the existing code and proposed code, summarizing how the code was changed. So to the question of what's new or what changed, this exhibit shows the before and after. The major topic areas are listed here. These are drawn from the list in Exhibit 5. And I was wondering if there's any questions I can answer about, what exactly a change was or to locate it in the code, to the extent that's helpful.
Looks like you're lucky.
Oh, I was, there's a joke about planners that goes, if you ask a planner for the time of day, they'll respond with a lengthy explanation about how a watch is made. And I was expecting to be a walking joke today, but guess not.
I have a question for you.
Yes, please.
There was some public comment around what the public agency exception is going to be and look like. And reading the matrix, it doesn't look like it, although being recodified and renumbered, it doesn't look like that provision is being changed?
It's actually being added. So the matrix has so it does not exist in the 2005 code.
Oh.
So it's a new addition to the proposed code.
Okay. Well, whenever is a good time during your presentation to talk about that, I would like a little bit more of an explanation in terms of how the planning department thinks that exception would work, and if there are examples of a type of a project where a public agency, what type of public agency might come in and ask for an exception, and just, how that would flow out.
Sure. So it would be used for cases where some kind of project, for example, utility, road, other kinds of infrastructure, for some reason would not be able to meet every provision of the critical areas code. And these are commonly in cities' codes because public projects are sometimes a different beast than typical commercial or residential development. For example, a road or a utility line can't be minimized or reconfigured often in a way that, say, a house or a building could. You can't have 90% of a road, right? Or it wouldn't fulfill its purpose. So that provision is there to, just as a extra safeguard, just in case there's a project that would not otherwise be able to meet the critical areas code.
And so so the city itself or a county or WashDOT or?
I believe all of those. Do you have examples you can think of? You've probably seen more than I have.
Probably the classic example on a city like Mercer Island would be the sewer main that needs to run through the lowest spot on a property, which is often also occupied by the wetland. Wetlands don't allow sewer mains through them naturally. So the public agency exception, if we're trying to address a community good, providing public sewer to a property, the public agency exception would provide that type of flexibility. You'll sometimes see this for roads. So perhaps a road widening project on East Mercer that needs to expand the amount of stream that's culverted would be another example. You could see it for maybe the King County sewer main. I don't know if it's part of the project for the current expansion, but you could contemplate a situation where you need to expand a fairly large King County facility as well. WashDOT typically preempts the city's authority to protect critical areas as a state agency, with limited exceptions if they own real property on the island. So it's probably more the county and the city agencies or the public utilities in general. So PSE or Comcast arguably could pursue some of this. Pardon me, not Comcast, PSE.
So how has the need for that type of an exception been handled in the past under a code that didn't have the exception?
It's not clear to me how it's been handled in the past, and that's part of the reason I want to make sure that we have a clear process.
Great, thank you.
Any other quick changes or questions about changes that were made, reasons? Okay, good. Just to briefly go through the rest of the packet, Exhibit 6 has the gap analysis matrix. This, so the matrix was prepared by the city's consultant and identifies each point in the city's existing code where there was either a gap between the existing code and today's best available science, or where there was an opportunity to clarify the code. So the two rightmost columns were filled up by staff and explain how each item was addressed. So it's kind of a paper trail showing how the city's consultants' recommendations were followed. Exhibit 7 is the best available science reports produced by the city's consultants. This is the information that was the key input into the code update. And Exhibit 8 is a compilation of public comment. And then Exhibit 9 is the initial determination of consistency, which we discussed earlier. Are there questions about anything in the packet or anything about this project going forward?
Just a quick one on Exhibit 7, the critical areas ordinance update. I say there are two versions of it presented, a planning commission review draft and then another version of it. I didn't get a chance to try and figure out what the differences were, but you included both. So I was just curious whether there's something we should be aware of with why both versions were presented.
They're actually two different documents on two different topics. I know one says it's a planning commission draft. That one is on the topics of geologically hazardous areas. And then the other is on watercourses, wetlands, and fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. It's labeled differently because we did another version.
Yeah, it's clear as soon as I look at the title,
Okay,
the
yep.
subtitles.
It was
not
hidden.
The titles, but the subtitles. Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Anything else that
Looks
could be
like
helpful?
no other questions there.
Okay, in that case, I have recommended
Any other
motion.
questions, council? No?
We have a number of sort of detailed things that I ideally would have put into an email in advance, but didn't. I think they'll go quickly. No, trust me, I think they'll go quickly, but I do want to run through them. So, for instance, let me just start on page 32, if I could. The definition of a buffer, I just couldn't get the English to work for me on that. I couldn't read it and convince myself that it made grammatical sense. And so I would just ask that that get looked at and try and figure out whether it does indeed make sense. But no need to solve that tonight. On page 34, there's the word IFSH, which I think is fish, with a slight typo to it, line 4. Page 49. Top of the page, I see that we've deleted, and I'll just read it, the development of 2 or more dwelling units on a lot abutting the ordinary high water mark should provide joint use or community dock facilities when feasible rather than allowing individual docks for each lot. It's been struck here, and I was curious, it seemed like it was a reasonable thing to have there. Why has it been struck?
It was actually moved to page 41. A suggestion from other planning staff was that some of these standards would be more user-friendly if they were moved to a different section, so it's still there.
Okay, but just shifted.
Correct.
And then page 40, jumping back to page 40, forgive me, council members, or Deputy Mayor, if you want to take somebody else, that's fine. But page 40, lines, say, 8 through 15, I was only struck by the fact that this seemed to not match my recollection of constraints back when we did the SMP work on one's flexibility in rebuilding structures. And so that's a vague comment / question, and forgive me for not having more to that, but it says here that you could completely replace a non-conforming structure, and I guess I'm just looking for confirmation that that really is the past intent and intended to be the future intent here, because I don't recall that we permitted that in the past, but again, it's just me trying to recollect.
You have something to say? Yeah. Please.
So I'll also call your attention to the page, I think, immediately before, so page 39, where you'll see a paragraph around relationship to other code sections, which include the bulk of Title 19. Recall that your Chapter 1901 has specific standards around repair of homes, single-family dwellings, for the 40% rule we spoke about at one point, or if you remove 40% of the exterior walls of a building, you have to come into compliance. So these non-conforming rules will need to be read collectively when applied to a specific site. You have non-conforming standards that are specific to shoreline, shoreline limitations on a lot, which are captured in this new Chapter 19.13. Those don't include things like non-conforming GFA, non-conforming setbacks from side property lines, things of that nature, lot coverage, hardscape. Those would be governed by, those standards would be governed by the non-conforming rules in Chapter 1 of the Title 19. Non-conforming standards, say in the Shoreline Master Program related to a house that's non-conforming from the shoreline setback, would be governed by the section that you're focused on at the moment. Does this make sense, Councilmember?
I think so. What you're saying, I guess I'm trying to parrot it to make sure I understand it, is that this can only be read within the context of other limitations that are closer to what I'm recollecting as the limitations, and so this is only a subset of that.
Yeah, and we do have kind of a general statement there, and then a more specific provision further down in the code that we spoke about a few minutes ago related to the repair of existing docks and the threshold at which those docks need to come into compliance in that first 30 feet from the shoreline. So these do need to be read together, to your point.
That's all I've got. Thank you.
Celine. Okay, so Evan, I think this question is for you. Thanks for coming back. So critical areas, if there's a house on a water course in a critical area on a slope that's already not in compliance with our new residential codes, and this new critical area ordinance buffer averaging comes in, that house has a tree fall on it, can that homeowner rebuild the old house, or do they have to comply with everything and potentially not have a buildable lot except for maybe 1,000 square foot shed? Like, tell me what that scenario looks like for homeowners down on East Mercer Way that might be in this uncomfortable situation.
Thank you, Councilmember. For instance, this feels like a hypothetical, so I'm going to answer it in the hypothetical. And I'm tempted to ask how big the tree was, but so you do have current critical area protection standards now. So the house may have been non-compliant or legally non-conforming, grandfathered to the current critical area regulations. If the tree fell on the house and damaged the house to the point where 40% of the exterior walls had to be removed to repair the house, that homeowner may have a problem. But the problem isn't necessarily that the lot is now unbuildable. It's how the current house would be replaced with a new house. Meaning, we would look at all of the tools that the Planning Commission has gone through in their recommendation to you and our existing RDS standards. And it can get quite complicated, so I'll list those out, but I'll look for council guidance on how far to dive on some of these. So if you have a house that's legally non-conforming from a residential development standard standpoint, setbacks, gross floor area, lot coverage, the 40% rule that I alluded to a moment ago would generally apply. If you had and perhaps this is really why you should have Robin answering the question, not me, pardon me, council member. So catastrophic loss, we actually have a repair in its entirety within 12 months of the date of loss. So I was parroting to you the essentially voluntary change, and we have a catastrophic repair. Meaning that if your house is, say it's a very large tree and it smashes the house flat, hopefully no one's hurt, you could build it just as it was before.
But you can't intentionally remodel it.
You couldn't change the exterior 40%. So if you were looking at remodeling your living room, if you were looking at renovating the interior of the house, it's a very straightforward structural discussion. If you're looking at renovating the kitchen and expanding it in a relatively modest way, parallel to the critical area or away from the critical area, it's still a relatively straightforward conversation, but it's more complicated. If you're trying to go towards the wetland or the watercourse that's on site, that's prohibited. And likely, frankly, would have been prohibited under the current code.
And that,
Thank you for
the catastrophic loss exception, that's not in anything we're looking at here, that's just in the regular building code?
That is, it's in so it's in chapter 19.01 of your land use code. And truly, this is why you want someone like Robin advising you at this point. She administers the code, and I'm second fiddle.
Okay, so seeing nothing else, do we want to try and grapple with this SMP issue? Sure. So,
yeah,
at the highest level, and so I would hate to try and explain it, but I'm going to take a stab. There's interest within the community to revise the SMP to uncouple this decking issue from this issue that is right now intrinsically tied to the whole structure. You talked about the barriers to it. We can either take the pulse of the council and see if there's interest in the council to have a discussion about the benefits of it. I mean, the benefits are pretty obvious. If we look at things like Wyra 8 or Clark Beach or Groveland Park and the beach restorations, the sewer projects, the various street ends, the things that we have done, could do, are doing, the cost of doing that is extremely expensive to the city, and the impact on the island is probably 2%, right? So vastly owned, the shoreline, by private parties. So if we can provide an incentive to make changes that are consistent with Wyra 8, with the Chinook Salmon Recovery Plan, that are largely good for the environment around us, I think there is a big enough benefit there to have a discussion. I would support it personally. I'm getting a nod down there. If you could find a way, can we have a conversation about how we might land this during this SMP update to get ecology to try and uncouple these two issues so that people can go out and do this decking projects without having to re-pier the dock, if that's a possibility.
And I'm interested in the structure of the dock, because it doesn't make sense to redeck it if the underlying structure is needing to be replaced while you're decoupling. So I'm thinking about new docks versus replacement docks and all of the dirt and water, all of that disruption to that environment and that ecology, right? So it's the decoupling and the sequencing of when you redo the structure as well as the decking and how you create the right incentives and make it as easy as possible to bring the docks up to environmental standards and best available science, while also considering that some of these docks have been here a long time.
So I want to make sure that we don't conflate two things.
To me, they're two separate
Okay,
things. It's
so
the
that's fine.
decoupling thing and maybe the footprint, grandfathering in of existing footprints of docks.
Okay, so let's deal with that beast after we get through with the decking issue, if you're okay with that. Because I know that I've heard enough support on the decking issue that if we could have that conversation and see if you could support that in this SMP update, maybe we can land that issue.
The microphone wasn't on. I apologize. I'm happy to approach Department of Ecology and see if that kind of amendment could be something that we could accommodate in this SMP update. There are a couple of things I think we should note just for council consideration. There's been, forgive the characterization, there have been some assertions made in the letter that I don't know that have been fully tested out around consistency with RIA-H, the Department of Fish and Wildlife guidance, and kind of our cumulative impact assessment that we would experience on Mercer Island. And as part of that conversation with the Department of Ecology, we will likely need to prove that out, which we can try and do. It becomes a matter of time and how much do you want this as part of this SMP update in June of 2019, or do we want to take it past June of 2019? And that is my real concern around this, is whether or not we can kind of have that conversation in a meaningful way with the Department of Ecology and bring it to completion quickly. That would be one item I just want to make sure is out there. When I looked at the Department of Fish and Wildlife guidance that was emailed around earlier this evening, I think actually the city's standard is likely more protective in terms of requiring docks to come into compliance sooner than the Department of Fish and Wildlife. That was my initial read of it. I understand how reasonable minds can disagree, but I think that's why we may need to prove this out a little bit further. Happy to have that conversation if that's the direction from the City Council tonight with the Department of Ecology. It does, the other question it raises in my mind is how do you want to proceed with June 4th, I believe, is your second reading, at least as currently tentatively scheduled. Depending on what the Department of Ecology says coming back, we may have code language that we could easily put into the SMP that would decouple, replacing the decking on the dock from bringing it into compliance, or we may have something otherwise. And I want to make sure that I give the City Council what it wants on June 4th.
And given that we have two people missing, I don't think we landed tonight, but is it fair to say, take a stab at it, come back to us at June 4th at the second reading and provide a better update, another update?
May I refine that just a touch? If we can incorporate it into the June 4th draft, and presuming that I at least see 4 or 5 nods tonight, we will look to do so. If we can't, we will provide feedback on the conversation that we've had with the Department of Ecology.
Okay. So I'd support that. I don't see anybody saying no.
I'm not there, and part of this is that I lived through the SMP process previously, and I know that we spent quite a few months back and forth with Department of Ecology, almost exclusively at loggerheads over the issue of dock width in the nearshore area. We did not land on that dock width result lightly or, by our own volition. That came out of a very lengthy negotiation with DOE. And I think if we want to unwrap this, it's going to take I don't think you can sort of open one little corner of this complex puzzle and just sort of change it. You're going to be forced into opening up the whole dock width question. So I don't oppose the idea of a further conversation with DOE, but I think we need to probably understand the whole contour of this thing before we know exactly what question it is we really want to ask them. I wouldn't want to take the question as framed by the attorneys and just pass that directly through. I think we ourselves need to understand the context and the other factors that fold into this before we know what the question to even ask staff to take to ecology is. So, well, that's I guess
Okay.
where I am is it's not as simple as just saying take the question as posed by the attorneys, go to DOE with it. It's if you want to go down this path, I think it's staff. You need to bring back to us. This is what I propose: is staff bring back to us a better understanding of the entire issue, so that we can understand it, perhaps and probably with whatever input we have, further input we have from the Planning Commission, because others presumably care about this issue as well. And then we're formulating a question that staff's taking to DOE.
Dave?
Just turn off. Let's see. You were halfway through, and I thought that's a little bit what we'll get from their research, is they'll come back and reframe it in a more correct context. I think they're going with a question and coming back with some more comprehensive advice, is my guess is how it works, but I'll ask you all.
So, Councilmember, I think we would have more advice for you on June 4th. Again, I'm going to offer my recommendation, which would be, I think this is going to be viewed as a substantive change which should be considered in the light of a full SMP review. That's to be borne out by the Department of Ecology. I could be misreading that. If that's the case, I would tend to stick with the recommendation I kind of foreshadowed earlier this evening, which is, I think this would be the kind of thing where I would suggest that the City Council really wants to identify the specific set of items, substantive changes to the Shoreline Master Program that warrant further Planning Commission and environmental review prior to action. There's one last nuance I'll throw out in case it's meaningful to the Council's consideration of this, which is I don't know that this would affect dock design or construction for this coming summer. Typically, when we're talking about large projects where you're expecting a repair and replace of a large amount of decking or dock area, that process starts earlier in the year to meet the fish windows established by the Department of Fish and Wildlife in typically April through August. So not knowing exactly when these regulations might take effect and how they might pan out, I think it's unlikely that they will benefit any dock owner this construction cycle. The next construction cycle would be about that April to August timeframe in 2020. So again, my recommendation would be a remand back to the Planning Commission around this specific set of issues, perhaps both the decking and the structural repair, if you will, and explore it more thoroughly. I'm happy to do the follow-up conversation with Department of Ecology if that's the direction I see tonight.
Okay, so do we have 4 supporting the decking?
Yeah.
I support it. We have 4.
Yes.
The structural, I'll support it as a conversation. We're not talking about writing any code. Happy to hear what they have to say about the structural. I think that probably tied together. Lisa?
I'm confused about what you mean when you say structural.
You probably have to have Evan explain that.
So the threshold that we've been discussing is the amount of repair on a dock that requires compliance with the narrowing standard within the first 30 feet from the shore out into the lake. And there's currently two components to that. One is replacing more than 50% of the decking, the surface, if you will, of the dock, and the other is replacing more than 50% of the structural components. In this context, structural components we've read to be distinct from the decking. So it would include things that you might think of as like a joist holding up the decking, stringers from pile to pile, the piles themselves. If more than 50% of those, and we do a straight count, so if you have, say, 16 piles, if you replace more than 8, or 8 or more, you're required to come into compliance. So I think the question I inferred from Councilmember Weiker's comment earlier was, could we decouple that 50% structural replacement from requiring a narrowing in the near shore? And I'm happy to answer that question.
Yeah, I think I'd be supportive of both. At least getting more information on it.
Okay, so I think we landed that. Does anybody have a motion on the original agenda, Bill?
So let me just make sure I'm tying this back. So, and it's partly because I'm not sure that I grasp it, but what's important is that you grasp it. Has council given you sufficient information to know what the question to DOE is at this point?
I believe I understand the two questions. If DOE says, hey, Evan, you misrepresented or misunderstood this, it's no big deal, just put it in, we will do that in your second draft and call your attention to it. If they say something other than that, I will report it back to you.
Great.
Great. Any motions?
I'll move to set ordinance numbers 19C-05, 19C-06, and 19C-07 for second reading and adoption on June 4th, 2019.
Very good. Any discussion? No? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. All right. By weight, I did a lot of work. Our final item of regular business in this Agenda Bill 5572, Interim City Manager Appointment Process and Timeline. Welcome, Human Resources Director Chris Siegel.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Neese. Chris Siegel, your Human Resources Director. So I just want to kind of outline the options that are before you for considering the appointment of an interim city manager, even though it's outlined in your agenda bill. And so it started with the announcement of a resignation by City Manager Underwood on May 7th. On that night of the council meeting, Mayor Bertlin announced that she and Deputy Mayor Neese would immediately begin working with staff to identify and understand the options available to council for appointing an interim city manager. So subsequently, staff did, Mayor Bertlin and Deputy Mayor Neese met with staff, and those options were identified, and those options are outlined in your agenda bill. So the first option is to appoint an internal candidate who is both qualified and willing to serve in the role, or appoint or recruit for and appoint an external candidate for the role. And so the primary differences between those two options is the timeline for getting somebody in the role, and then the cost associated with either using the interim or the internal option versus the external option. And then I just quickly put together the other considerations and comparisons between the two options. So the timeline for an internal candidate appointment is less than a month, and external would be 2 to 4 months, and that's just because we have to go through a recruitment process to find an external candidate. The cost of the recruitment, there's no cost for an internal internal candidate, there would be approximately a $300 cost associated with advertising for going with an external candidate. The cost to fill the position is the significant difference. So the internal option would cost approximately $15 an hour, and that is a premium not only for the internal candidate serving as interim city manager, but any premiums associated with other interim or expanded roles of other leadership team members or somebody to step in as interim Parks and Recreation, or I'm sorry, step in as department director. The cost to fill the external position is around $125 to $250 per hour, and that's just based on what some interim city managers that other cities have put into place, what they've been paying. And it's just typically a higher salary associated with appointing an external candidate. Additionally, and this is the most significant portion, the city would not realize any salary savings because we're replacing the city manager with an external candidate versus somebody in the organization serving up. So you wouldn't realize any salary savings like you do in the first option. And then additionally, if the council went with an external candidate, it's most likely that we would go through a staffing firm because they have basically a stable of retired city managers and executive level employees that serve these interim temporary roles. And in addition to the salary, we would be paying an administrative fee to the staffing firm. And then the organizational impacts is an internal candidate is a known quantity, hit the ground running, provides continuity and stability, because they are an established leader within the organization, and then also provides opportunity for a manager within the organization to serve in an interim role for our succession planning. The external candidate, even though we had an interim candidate in the past that had been a city employee, that's not likely to happen a second time with an interim role, an external candidate. So therefore, the leadership style and abilities of an external candidate are known predominantly through the reference checking process, but they would need some time to be an established leader within the organization and take time to get up to speed, and then continuity, maybe compromised, and stability doesn't occur until the person's been in the role for a little while. And then the limitations for serving in the interim role. When you appoint an interim candidate, an internal interim candidate, they're more likely to be able to serve until an appointment of a city manager has been made, versus an external candidate where they're usually time specific, and it oftentimes has to do with rules around the collection of their retirement while they're serving in that role. And then finally, the transition consideration is if you do an internal appointment, it allows Julie to work with that internal candidate immediately on transition planning versus going with an external candidate. We would not have somebody in place by June 8th, which is the day after Julie's resignation, her last day of employment. So in the meantime, staff worked with Deputy Mayor Neese and Mayor Bertland to identify Jesse Bond, Parks and Recreation Director, as the most qualified and willing internal candidate to serve in an acting interim city manager role. And so your decision tonight, the decision before you tonight is to affirm that appointment, affirm her into acting interim city manager role. And then the subsequent process steps would be for the council to review an employment agreement that has been previewed by the mayor and deputy mayor with discussions with the Parks and Recreation Director, and that would be done in executive session. And then provided the council's good with the terms of that agreement, you would come back in your regular meeting, presumably June 4th, and formally approve the appointment of Jesse into the interim city manager role. And then just real quickly, once an interim candidate has been appointed, then we will discuss the process for appointing a city manager. And the mayor's recommendation is that Deputy Mayor Neese and Councilmember Wong, whose terms carry over into 2020, sort of head up that process with staff and understand and identify the options. And then we would come back to the council in probably early September to present the options for recruiting a permanent city manager. So that's it.
Any questions? Lisa? No? Oh,
No.
sorry, so I reached.
I reached, but I don't think I have any.
No questions, all right. Any motions?
I affirm the appointment of Parks and Recreation Director Jesse Bond as acting interim city manager by the mayor and deputy mayor, and thank you very much for being willing to step up.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. Next motion.
I direct the mayor and deputy mayor to enter into an agreement negotiations with Jesse Bond for the interim city manager position.
Second.
All those in favor? Oh,
Aye.
no discussion. All those opposed? No, motion passes. Very good. All right. We now move to other business. Any upcoming council absences? Seeing none going once, going twice? None? Planning schedule. City Manager Underwood.
Council, would you be agreeable to having an executive session on June 4th from 5 to 6 p.m.? Continue. Is that okay? All right.
Yes.
Just want to confirm that. We'll get that on the planning schedule. Appreciate that. I think that was my main item to bring forward. And that's all I wanted to call out.
Okay. Council member, there's no board appointments, but Debbie and I are meeting in the morning. I know that some of you have sent feedback about candidates, so if there's anything out there remaining, please get it to me tonight or tomorrow morning. And same with Mayor Berlin. And council member reports. Anything short on that end?
Congratulations and shout out to the Mercer Island High School girls lacrosse team who won state for the first time ever, and the boys are up this weekend.
Nothing. Okay. The city council will now recess into executive session to evaluate the qualifications of an applicant for public employment for approximately 60 minutes pursuant to RCW 42.30.101G. The council is not expected to take final action after this executive session.